Step back with us tonight to Constantinople in the spring of 1453 as the Ottoman siege closes its grip. It is late May in the year 1453. On the heights above Constantinople, the campfires of an army 80,000 strong flicker against the darkened land walls. Inside the city, 7,000 defenders stand where once 200,000 lived in splendor, and the dome of Hagia Sophia rises pale above the sea mist, though by this time it may have been crowned with a crescent rather than a cross of gold. You are standing near the Tunka River in Edirne on the morning of 30 March 1432, where the river moves slowly beneath a sky the color of pale amber, and the cry of a newborn prince echoes through the palace of Sultan Murad II. The air carries the dry heat of an approaching Anatolian summer, and dust rises from the training fields beyond the western walls as cavalry horses circle in formation, their hooves stirring the earth into thin golden clouds that drift across the river's surface. Around you, the Ottoman capital breathes with the energy of a frontier empire still defining its edges, still learning the weight of its own ambition. Somewhere in the palace complex, a court official records the birth of a son who will one day answer to the name Mehmed, though for now he is simply the heir, wrapped in linen, presented to his father as a future sultan of the Ottoman Empire waits to inherit a world in motion. The infant Mehmed likely entered a court where Persian poetry was recited alongside military dispatches, and where Islamic law was studied in rooms that may have overlooked gardens with jasmine and cypress. His father, Sultan Murad II, governed an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Aegean, and the boy learned early that power was both inherited and constructed, both divine right and daily negotiation. You are walking through the palace corridors in the years that follow, and the dry heat of an Edirne summer presses against the shuttered windows as tutors instruct the young prince in history, in the strategies of campaigns fought by Alexander and Caesar, in the verses of Firdusi and the calculations of siege engineers. The dust rising from the training fields becomes familiar to Mehmed, a constant presence in his childhood, the distant thunder of hooves and shouted commands forming the percussion beneath his scholarly hours. According to later sources, he speaks 7 languages, though in these early years he is reportedly gathering them. Arabic for prayer and law, Persian for poetry and diplomacy, Greek and Latin for the manuscripts that will one day fill his personal library. By 1444, the boy born on 30 March 1432 is 12 years old, and his father abdicates in his favor. The young Mehmed II ascends to a throne he cannot yet hold securely, while his father reportedly retreats to Manassa, though some sources suggest he continued to exert influence behind the scenes. You are present in the audience chamber when the first reign begins, and the creak of leather and jingle of bridles in the Ottoman camp outside the city announces the constant movement of armies that the child cannot command. The brief first reign from 1444 to 1446 tests the structures his father built, and factional commanders maneuver around the adolescent sultan, their ambitions constrained only by the lingering presence of Murad II's authority. The dry heat of an Edirne summer still fills the palace rooms, but now it seems heavier, charged with the tension of a boy who must demonstrate capacity before he has finished accumulating it. The dust rising from the training fields takes on a different quality, no longer the backdrop of education, but the preparation for conflict that others will direct in his name. The shadow of Sultan Murad II falls across these years, even in absence, and when crisis demands it in 1446, the father returns from retirement to resume command, sending his son back to the margins of power with a lesson in the difference between title and capacity. You are watching from the palace gardens as Mehmed withdraws, and the pale light before dawn on the Galata shore seems distant, unimaginable, a future unconnected to this present of diminished expectation. The young prince continues his education in Islamic law, history, poetry, and military strategy, surrounding himself with scholars and artists from across the Mediterranean who recognize in him an intelligence that outpaces his political situation. The creak of leather and jingle of bridles continue through these years, but Mehmed hears them now from a distance, training his own mind while others train the armies he will one day claim. In 1451, Murad II dies, and Mehmed II, now 19 years old, returns to power with a clarity of purpose that his first reign had lacked. You are standing beside him as he takes the throne for the second time, and the air of Edirne carries a different weight, the dry heat of that summer seeming to concentrate around a single fixation that has grown in him since boyhood. The ancient city on the Bosphorus, Constantinople, Byzantine capital for more than 11 centuries, sits at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, and Mehmed, according to later sources, had long prepared for this moment, tracing its walls on maps, studying its harbors, learning the history of sieges that had broken against its defenses. The dust rising from the training fields now rises with direction, with the specific energy of armies being prepared for a particular destination. You feel the shift in the palace corridors, the way conversations narrow toward a single horizon, the way the seventh Sultan of the Ottoman Empire begins to shape himself into something his predecessors had not attempted. The young Sultan, known by the honorific Ebu letter to BLFET letter 1825, traditionally interpreted as father of the conquest, is portrayed as moving with the confidence of one who believes he is arranging history's arrival. He establishes the territorial, ideological, and economic foundations of the empire with a systematic intensity, building the administrative structures that will outlast any single campaign. You are walking through the markets of Edirne in these months, and the smell of charcoal and molten bronze from Urban's foundry begins to mingle with the ordinary commerce of spices and textiles, a harbinger of the industrial preparation underway. The Hungarian engineer named Urban is said to have been negotiated with and persuaded to cast a giant cannon that would reshape the possibilities of siege warfare, and the foundry works through the nights as well as the days, its fires visible from the palace windows. Mehmed II understands that conquest requires material invention as well as military courage, that the creak of leather and jingle of bridles must be accompanied by the deeper music of engineering. You are standing on the European shore of the Bosphorus, across the narrow strait from where the walls of Constantinople once stood, and the sound of masons' chisels at Rumeli Hisari, working through the night, fills the darkness with a rhythm of construction that seems to answer the older rhythms of the city opposite. The fortress rises with desperate speed, its towers and curtain walls designed to blockade the city from the north, seeking to close the sea lanes that had sustained Constantinople through centuries of earlier sieges. Mehmed II, now 21, reportedly supervises this construction with the urgency of youth, tempered by long preparation, and the fortress is said to be completed in 4 months, a feat that astonishes even the engineers who planned it. You feel the vibration of the chisels through the rock beneath your feet, and the pale light before dawn on the Galata shore reveals the structure's silhouette growing more complete each morning, its presence a message to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI that the world has changed. The Emperor Constantine XI understands the meaning of this construction as clearly as Mehmed intends it. You are present in the diplomatic exchanges that precede the final conflict, when Mehmed II offers the emperor terms of surrender which are rejected, and the formality of these negotiations cannot disguise the finality they both recognize. The dry heat of an Edirne Summer seems to have followed the Ottoman court to the Bosphorus, and the dust rising from the training fields now rises from the encampments assembling on the Thracian plain. Thousands of soldiers gathering for a campaign that will define an era. The smell of charcoal and molten bronze from Urban's foundry persists, for the great cannon must be transported, positioned, tested, and the Hungarian engineer works with the knowledge that his creation will be judged by history as much as by its immediate effects. The personal library of Mehmed II may have travelled with him or expanded in these months, for he was a sultan reputed to read widely, and his collection reportedly included Greek, Latin, Persian, and Arabic manuscripts on topics ranging from the history of Constantinople to Roman engineering and prophecies about the city's fall. You are sitting with him in the evenings before the final assault, and the creak of leather and jingle of bridles have become the ordinary music of his hours, no longer remarkable but simply present, like the breathing of a great machine that he has constructed and now sets in motion. He is considered, alongside Osman I, a second founder of the Ottoman Empire, and this consideration begins here, in the accumulation of force around a single point, in the transformation of long ambition into immediate action. The evening before the final assault arrives with a particular quality of light, and you are standing in the Sultan's tent as Mehmed II distributes promises to his troops, speaking to the various contingents in their own languages, for according to later sources, he speaks 7 languages and uses them now as instruments of persuasion. The Janissaries receive their assurances, the cavalry their assignments, the naval forces their coordinates for the morning's coordinated advance. The sound of masons' chisels at Rumeli has ceased, the fortress complete, its guns already trained on the waters it commands. You feel the tension in the tent, the way the young sultan moves among his commanders with a calm that seems to originate beyond the immediate moment, as though he has already seen the city fall, already assumed the title that posterity will confirm. The pale light before dawn on the Galata shore reveals the blockade tightening, the Ottoman fleet having maneuvered into position despite contrary currents and the defensive chains that span the harbour entrance. You are watching from the European shore as the first grey appears in the eastern sky, and the ancient walls of Constantinople emerge from darkness with the vulnerability of all things exposed to light after long concealment. The dry heat of an Edirne summer has followed the campaign to its conclusion, and the dust rising from the training fields seems to rise again from the trampled ground before the walls, the same golden particles stirred by the same purpose after 2 years of continuous preparation. The boy born in Edirne in 1432 now commands the scene he imagined as a student, and the 7th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire waits for the signal that will release the accumulated force of his patience. The final hours before the assault move with a slowness that seems deliberate, as though time itself is being stretched to accommodate the weight of what approaches. You are walking through the Ottoman camp, and the creak of leather and jingle of bridles have softened, the animals sensing the stillness that precedes movement, the held breath of thousands of men who have eaten their rations and checked their weapons, and now wait only for the command. The smell of charcoal lingers faintly, a residue of fires banked for cooking rather than forging, and the air carries the mineral scent of the Bosphorus, the salt and stone that have defined this place since before cities existed to contest its possession. The sound of masons' chisels at Rumeli exists now only in memory, the fortress standing complete on its promontory, its guns silent in these last moments before they will speak with the voice that Urban cast for them. Mehmed II moves through these hours with the composure that his education in Islamic law, history, poetry, and military strategy has prepared him to assume. You are near him as he prays, as he reviews the final dispositions, as he sends messengers to positions that have been chosen and rehearsed across months of preparation. The pale light before dawn on the Galata shore strengthens gradually, and the walls of Constantinople become more distinct, more vulnerable in their visibility. The ancient stones that have withstood so many assaults, now facing the particular combination of artillery and determination that Mehmed has assembled against them. The dust rising from the training fields of his youth seems present in this moment, the same particles that witnessed his education, now suspended in the air that carries him toward his defining action. The young Sultan, Ebu letter 2b LFET letter 1225, has established the territorial, ideological and economic foundations of the empire in these preparatory years, and the assault that approaches will confirm what the preparation has promised. You are standing at a point where the land meets the water, where the Bosphorus moves with its ancient indifference toward the human struggles that have always contested its shores. The conquest of Constantinople on 29 May 1453 will seal the end of the Byzantine Empire, and the hours that precede it belong to a particular quality of anticipation that you are sharing now. The sound of masons' chisels at Rumeli Hisari has been replaced by the deeper silence of completed work, the fortress standing as evidence of what planning and labor can achieve in compressed time. You feel the morning air moving across your face, carrying the salt of the strait and the faint warmth of fires extinguished and fires prepared, and the pale light before dawn on the Galata shore reaches a threshold where color begins to return to the world, where the gray resolves into the specific tones of stone and water and distant vegetation. The boy who was born in Edirne in 1432, heir to a rising frontier empire, has become the young man who will claim the city that his predecessors could not take, and the moment of that claiming approaches with the inevitability of sunrise. The last preparations unfold with a gentleness that seems almost out of place, the final adjustments of equipment, the last words between companions who may not speak again. You are moving through a camp that has become still in its readiness, the energy of anticipation having passed into a deeper reservoir of resolve. The dust that rises now rises from individual footsteps, from the slow movement of men toward assigned positions, and the dry heat of an Edirne summer has become the mild warmth of a May morning on the Bosphorus. The creak of leather and jingle of bridles have diminished to isolated instances, the mounted officers having reached their stations, the infantry forming in the patterns that Mehmed's strategy requires. You are standing now at a point where the land slopes gently toward the water, and the pale light before dawn on the Galata shore has become sufficient to reveal the texture of the ground beneath your feet, the small stones and compressed earth that will bear the weight of advancing armies. The sound of masons' chisels at Rumeli Hisari exists in the silence as a kind of afterimage, the memory of construction having given way to the fact of the fortress, its presence now simply part of the landscape that defines this morning. The young Sultan distributes his final instructions, his voice carrying the calm that comes from complete preparation, from the confidence of one who has surrounded himself with scholars and artists from across the Mediterranean, and learned from them the arts of war and the arts of peace, who has negotiated with a Hungarian engineer named Urban, and studied the manuscripts in his personal library, and waited for this moment, since before he could fully articulate what he was waiting for. The first sounds of the assault begin as distant percussion, and you feel the vibration through the ground before you identify its source, the great cannon speaking with the voice that Mehmed commissioned for it. The dry heat of an Edirne summer seems to gather around this sound, the accumulated warmth of years of preparation, released in a single continuous explosion that will not cease until the walls before it have answered with their collapse. The dust rising from the training fields of 1,000 mornings rises now from the impact of stone on stone, from the ancient fabric of Constantinople, responding to the new physics that Mehmed has brought against it. You are watching from a distance that seems to compress and expand simultaneously, the familiar becoming strange in the altered light of conflict, the pale light before dawn on the Galata shore now streaked with the smoke and disturbance of beginning. The morning progresses with a rhythm that seems to emerge from the land itself, from the meeting of European and Asian shores that has always made this strait a place of passage and contest. The creak of leather and jingle of bridles have transformed into the fuller sounds of mounted movement, of cavalry deploying along the land walls, of the naval forces attempting the difficult maneuver that will carry them past the defensive chain into the Golden Horn itself. You are moving through a landscape that has become fluid with action, the positions of mourning having dissolved into the continuous adjustment of assault, the defenders responding to each Ottoman advance with the desperation of those who know that no relief will come. The hours accumulate with a weight that presses against the senses, and you find yourself in a lull between phases of the attack, a moment when the sound of masons' chisels at Rumeli Hisari seems almost audible in the relative quiet, the memory of construction offering a strange comfort in the midst of destruction. The pale light before dawn on the Galata shore has become the harsher light of midday, and the dry heat of an Edirne summer presses down with its full intensity, the dust rising from the training fields now indistinguishable from the dust rising from the battered walls, the same golden haze obscuring the distinction between preparation and execution. The young Sultan moves through this landscape with the composure that has become his signature, Ebu letter to BLF et letter 1825, present wherever the assault requires his visible authority, his encouragement, his judgment of when to press and when to wait. The afternoon brings a shift in the quality of light, a softening that seems to correspond with the deepening of the conflict, the recognition on both sides that the issue will be decided before another dawn. You are standing at a point where you can see the walls of Constantinople, and the ancient stones that have withstood so many centuries now bear the wounds of Urban's creation, the great cannon having opened breaches that would have seemed impossible to the engineers of earlier ages. The creak of leather and jingle of bridles have given way to the fuller sounds of close combat, of men meeting at the walls with the weapons, and the desperation that will determine which empire continues and which becomes memory. The evening approaches with a slowness that seems to offer respite and deny it simultaneously, the light lengthening across the Bosphorus in patterns that have witnessed countless human struggles before this one. You are moving through the Ottoman camp as preparations begin for the final assault that will come with darkness, the young Sultan having determined that the city will not see another sunrise as a Byzantine possession. The pale light before dawn on the Galata shore seems to return in this evening light, the same quality of suspended illumination, of a world held between conditions, and the dust rising from the training fields of your earliest presence in this narrative rises again from the ground where Mehmed II prepares to complete the ambition that has defined his second reign. The final hours of daylight move with a gentleness that seems almost deliberate, as though the world itself is slowing to accommodate the significance of what approaches. You are sitting now on a slope above the Bosphorus, and the dry heat of an Edirne summer has softened into the mild warmth of evening, the air moving across your face with a freshness that carries the salt of the strait and the distant scent of cypress from the hills beyond. The sound of masons' chisels at Rumeli Hisari exists only in the deeper silence, the fortress having completed its purpose of blockade, its guns now contributing to the general bombardment rather than standing as separate achievement. The young Sultan, who will one day be called posthumously F.A. Macron T.I. letter 1E25, the Conqueror, moves among his troops with a quiet that seems to communicate more than any speech, his presence sufficient assurance of the purpose that unites them. You are near enough to observe the gestures of preparation, the checking of weapons, the final adjustments of armor, and the creak of leather and jingle of bridles have become the sounds of an army completing itself, of individual elements achieving the coherence that will carry them through the night. The darkness gathers with a gentleness that seems to fold around the landscape, the Bosphorus becoming a line of deeper darkness between the emerging stars. You are standing at a point where the European shore descends toward the water, and the texture of the ground beneath your feet has become indistinct, the small stones and compressed earth giving way to a general softness that mirrors the fading of visual detail. The dry heat of an Edirne summer has become the mild warmth of a May evening, and the air moves across your face with a freshness that seems to carry the future as well as the present, the knowledge that the morning will reveal what the night conceals. The sound of masons' chisels at Rumelihisari has become a memory within a memory, the fortress standing complete in the darkness, its silhouette occasionally revealed by the flash of artillery or the movement of signal lights. The young Sultan, Mehmed II, born on 30 March 1432, prepares for the final phase of his great ambition, and you are present in the moments of quiet that precede the decisive action. You find yourself moving through a landscape that has become familiar in its contours, the slopes and shorelines that you have traced across the months of preparation, now present in your body as much as in your perception. The dust rises faintly from your footsteps, and the dry heat of an Edirne summer seems to persist in the ground itself, in the stones that retain the warmth of the day even as the air cools around them. The sound of masons' chisels at Rumelihisari has become part of the silence, the completed fortress standing as evidence of what human labor can achieve in compressed time, its guns speaking now with the voice of finished work rather than ongoing construction. The young Sultan, who established the territorial, ideological, and economic foundations of the empire, moves through this darkness with the confidence of one who has prepared every element, who has studied and negotiated and built toward a moment that now arrives. The final preparations unfold with a slowness that seems to invite attention to each gesture, each adjustment of equipment, each whispered communication between companions who have shared the long months of approach. You are standing now at a point where you can feel the Bosphorus moving in the darkness, the current carrying its ancient indifference toward the sea, and the smell of charcoal and molten bronze from Urban's foundry returns faintly on a breeze from the north, where the great cannon waits for its final employment. The creak of leather and jingle of bridles have become the sounds of departure, of men moving toward positions from which they will not return until the city has fallen or the assault has failed. The young Sultan distributes his final encouragements, his voice carrying the calm that has become his signature, the composure of one who has prepared since childhood for a moment that now arrives. You are near enough to observe the quality of this calm, the way it seems to emanate from a depth of preparation that has absorbed every possibility, that has considered failure as well as success and chosen to proceed regardless. The dry heat of an Edirne summer seems present in this calm, the accumulated warmth of years of study and planning now concentrated in a single human presence. The boy born in Edirne in 1432, having become the man who will determine the fate of empires. The night moves with a gentleness that seems to fold around the waiting army, the darkness becoming a medium in which sound and movement occur with softened edges, with reduced urgency. You are walking through a camp that has emptied of its tension, the energy of anticipation having passed into the deeper reservoir of resolve that precedes decisive action. The young Sultan, Mehmed II, now prepares to complete the negotiation that diplomacy could not resolve. You are present in the final moments before the signal, and the pale light before dawn on the Galata shore seems to approach with infinite slowness, the hours of darkness having their own duration that resists the urgency of human purpose. The morning light on the Theodosian walls falls at an angle that reveals every contour of neglect, and you are standing upon the rampart walk where Constantine the 11th Palaiologos has paused to examine a section of masonry that has begun to separate from its core. Weeds grow between the stones in profusion now, their roots seeking the lime mortar that Roman engineers mixed in the 5th century, when the empire of the Romans still commanded resources befitting its name. The emperor's shadow stretches long across the parapet, for the sun has only recently cleared the hills of Anatolia across the water, and the salt smell of the Propontes mingles with smoke from cooking fires in the districts below. He has been walking the circuit of defences since before dawn, accompanied by 2 Italian engineers whose contracts specify payment in ducats rather than loyalty to Basileia ton Romain. The Byzantine Empire, which is the modern designation derived from Byzantium, the original name of Constantinople, has survived the fall of Western Rome by nearly 1,000 years through adaptation and endurance. Yet the direct continuation of the Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean now presents a spectacle that would have astonished its founders. The Palaiologos dynasty had ruled since Michael VIII restored the empire in 1261, and Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, became emperor in 1449 with full knowledge of what inheritance meant. Around you, the stones of the inner wall retain their massive dignity despite the accretions of time, and the hollow echo of footsteps in the Mise, the great street emptied of commerce, seems to rise even here above the rooftops. The Italian engineers gesture toward a tower where the outer wall has developed a pronounced lean, their Latin technical terms carrying across the morning air with the clarity of men who do not expect to be understood by the soldiers on the neighboring platform. The land walls of Theodosius II, built in the 5th century, still stood but were neglected, and you can trace with your eyes the succession of repairs that mark each period of desperate maintenance, each interval of abandonment. The cold marble of abandoned palaces, dust settling on mosaic floors, lies somewhere behind you in the direction of the Blashney Quarter, though from this vantage, only the irregular roofline of diminished grandeur is visible. At its greatest extent, under Justinian in the mid-6th century, the empire had stretched from southern Spain to Egypt, and the contrast between that memory and this present circumference of defences produces a silence in the emperor's retinue that no one disturbs. The population had fallen dramatically from perhaps 500,000 to around 50,000, and the streets that once received the grain fleets of Alexandria now accommodate only the diminished traffic of a city preparing for siege. The emperor moves onward along the walkway, and you follow at a distance that permits observation without intrusion. The taste of rationed bread, barley mixed with dried beans, still lingering from the morning meal taken in the courtyard of a monastery near the Golden Gate. The sound of church bells marking the hours, fewer now than in former centuries, drifts across from the direction of the Church of the Holy Apostles, where the dynasty of Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, maintains its memorials among the tombs of earlier ages. The empire had been financially exhausted by centuries of defensive wars, and the funds for proper restoration of these walls had not materialized in any of the recent fiscal years, despite the urgency that every informed observer recognized. The salt smell of the Propontes, intensifies as the breeze shifts and carries with it the voices of fishermen returning with catches too meager to feed a population already reduced by flight and famine. You are standing at the harbour at dawn in spirit, if not in body, for the circuit of the walls has brought the imperial party to the region where the land defences meet the sea, and the transition from stone to water reveals the vulnerability that geography has imposed. The sea walls were lower and more vulnerable, and the Italian engineers have already prepared their report on this subject for delivery to the Venetian and Genoese merchants in the city who remained for trade, not loyalty. The Genoese colony of Galata lay across the Golden Horn, technically neutral, and its towers were visible from this point as a reminder of how commerce had rearranged the political map of the Mediterranean. The chain across the Golden Horn was the last line of naval defense, and you can see where its supports descend to the water, the great links of forged iron lying ready for the moment of closure. The Byzantine navy had declined to a handful of vessels, and the harbour that once sheltered hundreds of war galleys now accommodates only fishing boats and the occasional merchantman seeking shelter from the winter storms of the Pontus. The hollow echo of footsteps in the Mise returns to your awareness as the emperor's party descends to the level of the city and proceeds along a route that avoids the most deserted quarters. The slow realization that no fleet is coming from Rome or Venice settles upon the council that convenes in the afternoon, and you are present in the chamber where the emperor receives the final dispatches from his agents in the west. The Union of Florence in 1439 had failed to produce meaningful military help, and the promises made in that Italian city have dissolved into the familiar pattern of papal expressions of concern, unaccompanied by galleys or gold. The Byzantine Empire, which emerged from the division of the empire in 395 CE, had long experience of Western alliances that proved more theoretical than material, and Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, knows the city could not withstand a determined siege without substantial reinforcement. The cold marble of abandoned palaces surrounds this chamber in the Great Palace, where the remnants of imperial administration maintain their rituals of consultation. The sound of church bells penetrates the thick walls with diminished force, as if even acoustic memory were subject to the general attenuation. He sought aid from the West, and the documents on the table before him record the responses: expressions of spiritual solidarity from the Pope, commercial concerns from the Venetian Senate, strategic calculations from the Genoese authorities in Galata. The taste of rationed bread accompanies the simple meal served to the council members, and you observe how the emperor eats sparingly, his attention fixed upon a map that shows the approaches to the city from both Europe and Asia. The salt smell of the Propontes enters through a window that overlooks the Sea of Marmara, where the afternoon light is beginning to take on the golden quality of autumn. The last harvest brought within the walls before the Ottoman army appears has already been distributed to the granaries, and the quantities are known to be insufficient for a prolonged investment. Even this reduced population presents a demand for calories that the hinterland cannot satisfy. The treasury lacks the funds to purchase additional supplies from the Italian merchants whose galleys still make the run from the Black Sea. The hollow echo of footsteps in the Mise testifies to the commercial decline that has preceded and will accelerate the political catastrophe. The Venetian and Genoese merchants in the city remained for trade, not loyalty, and their representatives in the council express their commitments in conditional terms that all present understand. The direct continuation of the Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean now depends upon the calculations of men whose primary allegiance is to banking houses in Genoa or Venice, and whose concept of the empire of the Romans extends no further than the security of their investments. The name Byzantine Empire is a modern designation derived from Byzantium, the original name of Constantinople, and the men in this chamber would have found the term unfamiliar, knowing themselves simply as Romans in the continuity of an ancient identity. The cold marble of abandoned palaces receives the declining light as the council disperses, and you follow the emperor through corridors where the mosaic tesserae still retain their gold in the upper registers, though the lower walls show the damage of centuries of reduced maintenance. The evening brings a change in the weather, and you are standing upon a terrace where the wind from the north carries a different quality. The first hint of winter's approach across the Thracian plain. The sound of church bells resumes with the vesper ringing, and the notes seem to hang in the air with a duration that matches the slowness of the day's events. The salt smell of the Propontes intensifies as the temperature drops and the atmospheric pressure changes, and the cooking fires themselves become more numerous as households prepare their evening meals. The taste of rationed bread has yielded to the taste of a thin soup made from dried vegetables, and the emperor's household observes the same dietary restrictions that he has imposed upon the general population. The Byzantine Empire has learned through long experience the necessity of shared sacrifice in moments of collective danger, though the efficacy of such solidarity in the present circumstances remains uncertain. The darkness brings a particular quality of silence to the city, and you move through streets where the hollow echo of footsteps in the Mies has given way to the more intimate sounds of residential quarters preparing for sleep. The abandoned structures between the inhabited ones create a pattern of density and vacancy that the night accentuates. The street lighting that once illuminated the main avenues has been reduced to occasional oil lamps outside churches or monasteries. The cold marble of abandoned palaces absorbs the faint luminescence of stars and the occasional candle, and you pass a structure where the open doorway reveals a space that once housed imperial officials, now occupied by families who have claimed the shelter of its remaining roof. The darkness conceals the weeds that grow between the stones of the walls, though their presence is known to every informed observer. The dawn of the following day arrives with a clarity that suggests the approach of a seasonal transition, and you are standing at the harbor where fishermen prepare their boats with the methodical movements of men who have learned to continue their routines regardless of political circumstance. The salt smell of the Propontes carries the particular freshness of early morning before the accumulated activities of the day have modified the atmospheric chemistry. The chain across the Golden Horn gleams where the rising sun strikes the metal, the engineering of earlier centuries still functional despite the general decline. The harbor presents a scene of maritime diminishment that would have astonished observers from the age of Justinian, when the fleet had dominated the eastern Mediterranean. The sound of church bells begins again with the matins ringing, and the notes carry across the water toward Galata, where the Genos colony maintains its own religious calendar and its own interpretation of neutrality. The emperor appears upon the waterfront, and you observe from a distance as he converses with a group of sailors whose knowledge of the maritime approaches may yet prove valuable. The inspection that follows occupies the early hours of the morning, with Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, walking the line of the shore defenses with the same attention he had given to the land walls on the previous day. The taste of rationed bread returns as you take a morning meal in a tavern that serves the harbor workers, the familiar texture of the coarse loaf requiring deliberate chewing. The hollow echo of footsteps in the Mies awaits his return, for the ceremonial route from the harbor to the great palace follows this ancient thoroughfare, and the emptiness of its arcades will accompany his passage. The midday finds the imperial party in the region of the Forum of Constantine, and you are present where the great column of porphyry still stands, its bronze reliefs long since stripped away and its core exposed to the weathering of centuries. The cold marble of abandoned palaces lies in every direction from this central point, and the contrast between the monumental intention of the founders and the present reality of diminished population produces a silence that the emperor's retinue does not disturb. The Empire of the Romans, which is the name the Byzantine Empire gave to itself, had erected these structures in confidence of perpetual duration, and the philosophical implications of their partial ruin accompany every step through their vicinity. The spaces between the surviving monuments of imperial grandeur have become the zones of ordinary life, the markets and workshops of a reduced city. The afternoon brings news that modifies the rhythm of the day, and you follow the messenger who carries his report toward the palace complex, his pace urgent but controlled, the discipline of imperial service still operative in his demeanor. The Ottoman outriders have been sighted upon the Thracian approaches, and the first elements of the investing force are expected within days rather than weeks. The closing of the great gates as the first enemy standards are seen on the horizon will mark a transition from preparation to endurance, and the mechanisms for this closure are being tested even as the news arrives. The gates themselves have swollen in their frames from years of imperfect maintenance, requiring additional labor to secure. The sound of church bells takes on a new quality as the population absorbs this information, the intervals between rings seeming to measure not merely time, but the diminishing distance between present routine and future extremity. The taste of rationed bread accompanies the evening meal in a household where the news has produced a particular intensity of family gathering, the members present conscious that such assemblies may become less possible in the immediate future. The salt smell of the Propontes enters through windows that have been closed against the cooling air, carrying with it the indefinable alteration that atmospheric pressure undergoes before significant events. The hollow echo of footsteps in the Mise resumes as curfew approaches and the inhabitants return to their quarters, the rhythm of footfalls upon ancient paving stones, producing a sound that seems to belong to no particular century. The psychological resources of the population have been depleted by successive emergencies that have never quite resolved into definitive catastrophe or restoration. The Byzantine Empire has known many moments of apparent terminal crisis, and the survival of these earlier experiences creates both hope and a certain fatalism in the present response. The night brings a quality of darkness that seems to absorb sound as well as light, and you move through streets where the cold marble of abandoned palaces is perceptible only as a denser absence in the general obscurity. The reduced number of watchmen and night patrols creates a silence that the occasional domestic sound does not dispel. The chain across the Golden Horn is visible only where it obscures the stars, a negative presence in the night sky. The sound of church bells continues through the darkness with a regularity that seems almost defiant in its persistence, the institutional memory of ecclesiastical timekeeping undisturbed by political crisis. The following morning arrives with a sky that carries the particular grey of autumn in this latitude, and you are standing upon the Theodosian walls, where the emperor has returned to observe the work of repair parties that labor with the urgency of men who sense the approach of a deadline. Weeds grow between the stones in profusion still, and the removal of this vegetation is among the tasks that the limited workforce attempts, though the root systems have penetrated deeply into the ancient masonry. The salt smell of the Propontes carries a sharper quality this morning, the wind having shifted to bring maritime air across the full extent of the city. Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, became emperor in 1449, with the knowledge that his predecessors had faced similar moments of extremity, some of which they had survived through fortune or endurance. The absence of any naval force upon the morning horizon confirms what the reports have already indicated, that the defense of the city will depend entirely upon its walls and the capacity of its inhabitants to man them. The taste of rationed bread accompanies the mid-morning break, and you observe how the work parties share their food with a formality that suggests the preservation of social ritual under conditions of material constraint. The hollow echo of footsteps in the Mies returns as the emperor's party moves toward the center of the city, their route taking them past the great church of Hagia Sophia, where the dome dominates the skyline with an assertion of spiritual permanence that the political situation cannot confirm or deny. The funds for proper maintenance of this greatest of churches have been as difficult to secure as those for the walls, though the religious significance of the structure ensures a minimum of attention. The cold marble of abandoned palaces lies in the quarter beyond the church, where the Blasiny Palace complex presents its diminished aspect to the morning light, its former imperial functions reduced to the administrative minimum. The afternoon brings a confirmation that modifies the general understanding of the city's situation, and you are present in the chamber where the emperor receives the final assessment of his military commanders. The men in this chamber would have identified themselves simply as Romans, yet the strategic situation they confront would have been comprehensible to any commander of any empire at any point in history, the eternal geometry of siege warfare. The sound of church bells accompanies this discussion with its regular punctuation, and the commanders note the time with the awareness that each interval brings the enemy closer. The evening finds the city in a state of suspended activity, and you move through streets where the salt smell of the Propontes carries an additional component, the smell of preparations that cannot be precisely identified, but suggest the organization of materials for eventualities. Even this reduced population presents challenges of coordination that the diminished administration struggles to meet. The taste of rationed bread has become so familiar as to seem normal, and you observe how the population has adjusted its expectations to the reduced circumstances, the memory of more abundant times receding with the speed that crisis always imposes upon recollection. The darkness brings a final quality of peace before the transformation that the following days will initiate, and you are standing upon a height where the landward approaches are visible as a darkness more absolute than the sky, the absence of settlement producing a void that the enemy will soon occupy. The Byzantine Empire now confronts the siege that its history has made both inevitable and somehow delayed beyond reasonable expectation. The hollow echo of footsteps in the Mies has ceased entirely, and the silence of the city extends to every quarter, broken only by the occasional animal sound or the distant voice of a watchman calling the hour. The cold marble of abandoned palaces receives the night with the indifference that inanimate materials always maintain toward human urgency, and the stars above the dome of Hagia Sophia proceed in their courses with the regularity that has accompanied every crisis of the empire's long duration. The sound of church bells resumes with the matins ringing, and you perceive in its diminished frequency a metaphor for the general condition, the reduced number of functioning churches corresponding to the reduced extent of imperial territory. The chain across the Golden Horn represents the final assertion of a naval tradition that has declined to the point of symbolic gesture. The morning light upon the empty harbor confirms what every observer has already internalized. that the sea which once brought the empire its power, now presents only avenues of approach for forces beyond its capacity to resist. The salt smell of the Propontes intensifies as the dawn breeze establishes its daily pattern, and the smoke from cooking fires rises from fewer sources than in former times, the diminished population producing a corresponding reduction in the visible signs of habitation. The emperor has positioned himself upon the highest accessible point of the land walls, and you follow his gaze toward the west, where the first indications of the approaching force are becoming visible, the dust of mounted columns rising against the line of hills. The sulphurous smoke of the foundry still lingers in your throat as you make your way through the narrow streets of Adrianople, the Edirne of the Ottomans, where a Hungarian engineer named Urban has been laboring for months in the casting pits. You're walking past the workshops where bronze is heated to liquid fire, past the heaps of charcoal and the piles of molding sand that line the thoroughfare like banks of grey snow. Around you, the air tastes of metal and burnt earth, and the sound of hammers on cooling bronze follows you like the memory of thunder. The cold air moves across your face, carrying with it the particular sharpness of winter giving way to spring, and you pull your cloak tighter as you approach the great yard where the largest piece of artillery ever constructed is nearing completion. Urban had come to these lands seeking a patron worthy of his ambition, and you are standing now at the very place where his fortunes turned. He had presented himself first at the court of the Byzantine emperor, offering services that might have altered the course of events now unfolding at Constantinople. Constantine the 11th had listened to the engineer's proposals with the weary attention of a ruler who has already spent his treasury many times over, and when Urban requested a sum that the imperial coffers could not supply, the negotiations dissolved like salt in water. The Hungarian engineer gathered his plans and his pride, leaving the Byzantine court for the camp of the enemy who would now possess the weapon that might destroy the 1,000-year empire. The foundry yard opens before you, and the scale of what has been created here arrests your breath. The largest cannon, named Basilica by those who have labored upon it, lies in its wooden cradle like a sleeping leviathan of bronze. 27 feet long, it is a tube of metal that seems to belong to another order of creation entirely, something dredged from the dreams of giants. The basilica could fire stone balls of approximately 600 kilograms, masses of carved rock that would shatter against the ancient walls of Constantinople like the fist of an angry god. You place your hand upon the cooling flank of the weapon, feeling the slight vibration of the metal still settling from its last firing, and the sulphurous smoke seems to rise from your very sleeve, lingering in the throat as it has since your arrival. The testing ground has been prepared at the fortress of Rumelihisari, the new castle built to command the narrowest waters of the Bosphorus, and you are present on the morning when the first shot is fired. You are standing on the battlements, the fortress that Mehmed raised in impossible haste to strangle the Byzantine capital rising around you, and before you the great cannon has been wrestled into its firing position. The deep bass note is felt in your chest before it is heard, a pressure that seems to compress the very air around your heart, and then the sound arrives, rolling across the water like the voice of the earth itself. The stone ball, a mass of carved limestone, arches across the grey expanse of the strait and splashes into the Bosphorus with a column of white water that rises like a sudden tree of foam before collapsing back into the waves. They will say the sound could be heard 10 miles away, and you believe it, for your ears are still ringing with the aftermath as the smoke drifts across the water toward the Asian shore. The groan of oxen straining in their traces accompanies your journey now, for you have joined the procession that will drag this instrument of destruction to the siege lines outside Constantinople. 60 oxen, their broad backs glistening with effort, their hooves churning the mud of the spring roads, are required to move the basilica, and 200 men labor alongside them with levers and ropes and the constant anxiety of catastrophe. The whip cracks of drivers punctuate the hours like irregular heartbeats, and the column moves at the pace of a funeral procession, which in many ways it resembles. The 3-week journey to the siege lines will be remembered as one of the great logistical achievements of the age, a testament to Mehmed's determination that nothing shall stand between his ambition and its object. You walk beside the great weapon as it tilts and sways on its carriage, the bronze tube catching the pale sunlight like a second moon fallen to earth, and you wonder at the minds that conceived such a thing and the hands that made it real. April has come to Thrace, and with it the bitter cold of nights that penetrates even the warmest cloak, the chill that settles in the bones and makes every movement an act of will. You are standing now in the Ottoman siege lines opposite the Mesotician, the weakest section of the Theodosian walls, and before you the great cannon has been positioned with the care of a surgeon preparing his incision. The Theodosian walls had never been breached in their 1,000-year history. These triple defenses that had turned back Bulgars and Rus and Arabs and Persians, the work of generations of Byzantine engineers who had believed their creation eternal. The Mesotician, where the land walls dip into the valley of the Lycus River, has always been the vulnerable point, the place where the terrain conspires against the defenders, and it is here that Mehmed has chosen to concentrate his most terrible weapon. The dawn of April 1453 breaks grey and still, and you are present as the first preparations begin. Each shot requires 3 hours to prepare, a ritual of measurement and loading that must be performed with exactitude, for the forces involved are sufficient to destroy the weapon itself if mishandled. The powder is poured in measured cascades. The great stone ball is lifted by block and tackle and eased into the maw of the tube, and the crews stand back with the resigned patience of men who have learned that haste is the parent of disaster. You feel the anticipation that runs through the Ottoman ranks like a current in still water, the silence that precedes the unleashing. The spark is applied, and the world dissolves into noise and smoke. The recoil damages the ground beneath it, throwing up a cloud of earth and stones that patters down like hail upon the assembled soldiers, and the cannon itself rocks backward in its cradle with a motion that threatens to tear it free of its constraints. The stone ball is visible for a moment, a dark sphere against the pale sky, and then it strikes the ancient walls with an impact that seems to shake the very foundations of the city. The splintering of limestone fills your ears, ancient mortar crumbling like dry bread where the ball has found its mark, and a section of the outer wall sags inward with the groan of a wounded animal. You are witnessing the moment when one age dies and another is born in fire and thunder, the technology that shifts warfare from medieval siege engines to gunpowder. The day passes in a rhythm of loading and firing that exhausts the crews and terrifies the defenders. The cannon could fire only 7 times a day due to cooling requirements, 7 thunderbolts that mark the hours like a diabolical clock, and after each firing, the bronze must be swabbed and cooled with wet sponges and allowed to rest. The psychological effect on the defenders is nearly as great as the physical damage, for the Byzantines have never faced a weapon of such power, never known the particular terror of waiting for the next ball to arrive, never heard the sound that announces the possibility of their annihilation. You watch as the smoke from each discharge drifts across the siege lines, the sulphurous haze now multiplied 1,000-fold, and you see the faces of the Ottoman gunners blackened with powder residue, their eyes red and watering, their movements mechanical with fatigue. The sun sets upon a scene of devastation that will be repeated in the days to come. The cannon creates breaches, but also warns the defenders where the next assault will come, for the concentration of fire upon a single section of wall announces Mehmed's intentions with unmistakable clarity. The Byzantines repair the walls at night with stones, earth and wooden stockades, and you are present as this desperate labor unfolds under the cover of darkness. The bitter cold has settled upon the city, and you can see the repair crews moving by torchlight, their hands numb on shovels and pickaxes, their breath rising in clouds that catch the flickering illumination. The Theodosian walls, ancient and proud, receive this makeshift surgery with the patience of stone, and by dawn the breaches have been filled with whatever materials can be scavenged. Earthen ramparts thrown up behind shattered masonry, wooden palisades lashed together with ropes and prayers. Mehmed also employs smaller cannons along the entire length of the walls, a continuous bombardment that keeps the defenders from concentrating their attention upon the great weapon opposite the Mesotician. You walk the siege lines in the hours between the firings of the basilica, and the lesser pieces speak in sharper voices, cracking like distant lightning against the fortifications that have never before been tested by such methods. Urban moves among his creations with the pride and anxiety of a father whose children are both gifted and dangerous, inspecting the bronze for signs of strain, measuring the bores for wear, calculating the charges with the precision that his craft demands. He has found in Mehmed's service the patron that Constantine could not be, and the irony of this circumstance will not be lost upon those who survive to consider it. The days of bombardment blend into one another, each sunrise bringing the same sequence of thunder and repair, destruction and desperate renewal. You have learned to feel its approach in the vibration of the ground beneath your feet, the deep bass note that arrives in your chest before your ears can register its passage. With each discharge, the recoil damages the ground beneath it, requiring constant repositioning as the great weapon slowly excavates its own firing pit, sinking deeper into the earth with every shot, until the crews must build platforms and ramps to restore its angle of elevation. The 3 hours of preparation between each firing are filled with the anxious inspection of the tube, the measurement of the powder, the prayerful placement of the stone ball that will arc across the contested ground to seek the ancient walls. The siege has entered its second month, and the rhythm of bombardment has become the heartbeat of the Ottoman camp, the great weapon speaking 7 times each day in a language that all can understand. May has arrived with its longer days and its promise of worse to come, the heat that will compound the sufferings of defenders and attackers alike. You are present on a morning when the preparations proceed with their usual deliberation, the powder measured and poured, the ball lifted and seated, the crews withdrawing to their stations with the practiced movements of men who have performed this ritual many times. The Mesotician has been pounded into a landscape of rubble and dust, and the great cannon has been shifted to new positions as the siege works advance toward the city. But this morning something is different, a tension in the air that you cannot immediately identify, a hesitation in the movements of the gunners that speaks of unspoken fear. Urban is directing the loading of one of his smaller pieces, a bronze cannon of more conventional dimensions that has been brought forward to supplement the fire of the great basilica. The Hungarian engineer bends over the tube with his instruments, measuring the charge with the care that his craft demands, and you are close enough to see the concentration upon his features, the slight frown that suggests some calculation still unresolved. The explosion comes without warning, a detonation that seems to originate from within the bronze itself, the tube splitting along its length with a violence that scatters metal fragments like the shrapnel of a grenade. You are witness to the moment when his ambition and his artistry are extinguished in a single catastrophic instant. The Sultan himself is present, Mehmed II, who has staked his reign upon this siege, and you see him flinch backward as the pieces of bronze fly through the air, his face momentarily bare of the composure that he maintains at such cost. The smoke rises in a column that mingles with the sulphurous haze of the firing pits, and the cries of the wounded follow it like a secondary explosion of human suffering. The aftermath is confusion and silence in strange alternation, the silence of men who have seen what cannot be unseen, the confusion of a military operation suddenly deprived of its guiding intelligence. The Hungarian engineer who had cast the great cannon at Adrianople, who had tested it at Rumeli before being moved to the siege lines, who had positioned it opposite the Mesotician, is now a scattered presence upon the ground, his genius dispersed with the violence that his own creations have made possible. You stand at the edge of the crater where the smaller cannon has destroyed itself, and a chill seems to have returned despite the advancing season, one that originates not in the weather, but in the contemplation of mortality. The siege continues, for the great basilica remains operational, and the crews who have learned their craft from Urban's instruction continue the bombardment with the mechanical precision of men who have no other function. The Theodosian walls have never faced such a weapon for such a duration, and the accumulated damage begins to tell upon their ancient fabric. You watch the desperate labor of the repair crews continuing despite the loss of the engineer who might have ended it more quickly. The death of the principal artisan does not halt the progress of gunpowder warfare, for the knowledge has already spread beyond any single mind. The days that follow Urban's death are marked by a strange solemnity in the Ottoman camp, as if the passing of the Hungarian engineer has reminded all present of the costs that such ambitions exact. The Byzantines have become adept at reading the preparations, anticipating the fall of the stone balls, concentrating their repair efforts upon the sections most threatened. Yet you observe in the torchlit labor of the knights a resilience that speaks of something beyond fear, a determination that the ancient walls shall not fall while hands remain to defend them. The groan of oxen has ceased now, for the great cannon has reached its final position and requires no further transport. The whip cracks of drivers that accompanied the 3-week journey are memories that mingle with the other sounds of the campaign, the thunder of the weapon itself, having replaced them in the auditory landscape of the siege. You walk among the Ottoman batteries in the hours of darkness, when the firing has ceased and the cooling of the bronze proceeds in silence, and you hear the voices of the gunners speaking in low tones of their lost master, the Hungarian who had come from nowhere to change the nature of war itself. The splintering of limestone has become the percussion of your days, the ancient mortar crumbling beneath the repeated impact of the stone balls, and you have grown accustomed to the sight of destruction so continuous that it seems almost natural. Yet the Theodosian walls stand, diminished and wounded, but unbroken in their essential structure, and the defenders continue their nightly labor with a patience that matches the patience of the attackers. The bitter cold of April nights has given way to the milder temperatures of May, but the hands that work by torchlight are still numb with fatigue and with the particular chill that comes of laboring in darkness after days of terror. The great basilica continues its work, the 7 daily shots marking the passage of time in a rhythm that has become as familiar as the rising and setting of the sun. You have learned to anticipate its arrival in the tension of your own body, the involuntary bracing that precedes each discharge. You imagine listeners in distant villages, peasants who pause in their labors to count the thunderbolts, children who have learned to associate the noise with the fall of the ancient empire that seemed as eternal as the mountains themselves. The recoil has damaged the ground beneath it with each shot, and the position of the great weapon has become a depression in the earth, a testament to the forces that it has unleashed. The constant repositioning required by this destruction of its own foundation has become part of the ritual of firing, the crews laboring with levers and ropes to restore the angle after each discharge, the engineers measuring and calculating with the care that Urban taught them. The Hungarian engineer is present now only in the weapon that survives him and the methods that his successors employ. The siege enters its final phase, and the bombardment intensifies beyond the capacity of the defenders to repair. The accumulation of damage has outpaced their efforts, and the breaches grow wider with each passing day. The proof of the shift from medieval siege engines to gunpowder warfare is visible in the gaping wounds that now deform the ancient fortifications. Maimed smaller cannons along the entire length of the walls prevent the concentration of repair crews upon the great breaches opened by the basilica. You observe in the faces of the Byzantine soldiers a weariness that transcends the merely physical, the exhaustion of men who have lived with the sound of the cannon for too long, who have repaired the same walls too many times, who have watched their ancient defenses prove themselves mortal after all. The month is nearly done, the days of bombardment having blended into a continuous experience of noise and dust and desperate labor that seems to have consumed an age rather than a handful of weeks. The sulphurous smoke of the foundry has long since dispersed, but the haze of the firing pits remains a constant presence, lingering in the throat, coating the tongue with the taste of the new warfare. You are standing now at a distance from the great cannon, watching the preparation of what will be one of the final shots before the assault that Mehmed is planning, the general attack that will follow upon the breaches that the weapon has created. The Mesotitian is no longer recognizable as a defensive work, but rather as a landscape of rubble through which an army might force its passage. The stone ball is lifted, the charge is poured, the crews withdraw to their stations with the movements that have become automatic through repetition. The splintering of limestone fills the air, ancient mortar crumbling, and a section of the inner wall that has been repaired too many times finally surrenders to the accumulated violence. The defenders know with terrible certainty what this latest destruction portends. A different cold seems to settle upon the city as you stand in the aftermath of the firing, the smoke drifting across your face with its familiar sting, the silence that follows the thunder seeming almost unnatural in its completeness. The labor of months has compressed into the preparation for the final act. The night falls, and you watch the repair crews moving in the darkness with their torches and their materials, the desperate labor that has become the defining experience of the defenders. Tonight, the work seems different, more frantic, more aware of its own futility. The men who labor by torchlight know that they are fighting not merely an army, but an age, that the world they have known is passing even as they struggle to preserve it. You imagine the sound reaching the ears of those who will write the histories, who will attempt to convey in words what can only be understood in the body, the vibration that seems to reorganize the very organs of perception. Urban is present in every shot that continues after his death, his ambition surviving him in the weapon that bears the imprint of his mind. The great cannon has settled into its final attitude, the depression that it has excavated now its permanent home. The constant repositioning has ceased, for there is no longer need to shift the weapon, the breaches having been opened sufficiently for the purposes of the siege. The final shots approach, the sequence of thunder that will precede the general assault. The 3 hours of preparation between each firing continue to be observed, the ritual exactitude that Urban established surviving his own death as the weapon itself survives. You observe in the torchlit labor of this night a quality of desperation that speaks of the psychological effect of the bombardment, the knowledge that the ancient walls have failed, that the 1,000-year history of successful defense is drawing to its close. The cold of recognition and acceptance has settled upon the city, the surrender horizon, a light that carries no promise of renewal, only the illumination of what has been decided in the darkness. The first exchange of arrows and gunfire along the walls comes with the afternoon, a scattered, tentative dialogue of violence that announces the formal beginning of what history will call the Siege of 1453. You are standing upon the parapet when the first Turkish arrows arc against the sky, their flight visible only for a moment before they fall among the stones or find the flesh of those who have not learned the rhythm of ducking and rising. The defenders reply with crossbows and the occasional report of a handgun, these new weapons of powder and flame, still strange enough to seem almost miraculous in their operation. The spring rains of the previous week have turned the siege lines to soft mud that clings to your boots, and you observe how the Ottoman archers sink to their ankles as they advance to loose their shafts, how the mud claims the shoes of the dead and the living alike. The great bombards that Mehmed has brought to the siege speak with voices that shake the ancient stones, and each report sends a vibration through the parapet beneath your feet that you feel in your teeth and in the hollow of your throat. Already this pattern establishes itself as the grammar of the siege, the long sentences of silence punctuated by the explosive verbs of stone and iron. You learn to read the timing of the gunners, to anticipate the interval between the flash and the impact, to know by instinct when the next breath of fire will issue from the distant emplacements. The fleet was initially unable to enter the Golden Horn due to the chain, and this fact sustains the defenders through the first dark days of investment. The Byzantines had a small fleet of about 26 vessels, a pitiful force against the hundreds of ships that Mehmed has assembled, yet the iron barrier transforms this numerical disadvantage into a temporary equality. You watch from the walls as Ottoman galleys probe the entrance, testing the strength of the links with their oars and their courage, and each failure brings a murmur of relief from the watching crowds. Its silhouette against the setting sun becomes a symbol of the city's defiance, a dark line drawn across the water that says asterisk, thus far and no farther asterisk. An Ottoman naval attack on 20 April was repulsed, and you are among the defenders who watch from the parapets as the enemy vessels retreat in confusion. The defenders sank a Turkish ship, attempting to break the chain, and the spectacle of that vessel burning upon the water draws a cheer from the throats of men who have had little enough to cheer in the preceding fortnight. This moment of collective exultation will sustain morale through the grinding weeks to come. You feel the rough stone beneath your palms as you lean forward to watch the survivors swimming for the Asian shore, and the cold air moves across your face, carrying the smell of burning timber and the cries of drowning men. Mehmed built a fleet of pontoons to transport troops across the Bosphorus, an engineering response to the obstacle that the chain presented, and you observe these strange craft from the walls as they begin to ferry soldiers to the northern shore. The Sultan moved part of his fleet overland to bypass the chain, a maneuver so audacious that it seems to belong to the realm of legend rather than military practicality. Yet the reports confirm that ships are being dragged across the hills on greased rollers, that the Ottoman mind has found a solution where direct assault has failed. The taste of brackish water from the cisterns grows more familiar with each passing day, and the careful rationing becomes a discipline of survival that mirrors the larger discipline of the siege itself. The steady attrition of the garrison, fewer men each dawn, becomes apparent in the faces of those who gather for the daily distribution of bread. Every wound, every fever, every death from the random fall of stone reduces this number in ways that cannot be replaced. You see it in the growing gaps among familiar faces, in the reassignment of men to unfamiliar stations, in the quiet conversations among officers who calculate how long the remaining force can hold the full extent of the landward walls. The smell of damp wool and rusted mail on soldiers sleeping in the open has become the permanent atmosphere of the city, a communal odor of endurance that clings to every garment and every wall. Mining operations began beneath the walls in late April, a new dimension of warfare that transforms the solid ground itself into a battlefield. The Byzantines countermined, meeting Ottoman sappers underground, and you descend into this subterranean world with a party of Greek engineers who have learned to listen for the sound of enemy digging through the thickness of earth and stone. This fighting by torchlight in claustrophobic tunnels belongs to a geography of darkness that seems disconnected from the familiar world above, where the sun still rises and the seabirds still cry between the bombardments. Greek fire, blue and terrible, illuminates moments of combat so intimate that the men engaged in them can smell each other's breath, can see the whites of each other's eyes in the unnatural light. The substance clings and burns with a ferocity that water cannot quench, and in the confined space of the tunnels, its use becomes a weapon of mutual destruction, a promise of shared annihilation for victor and vanquished alike. You emerge from these depths with earth in your hair and the taste of clay upon your lips, grateful for the ordinary sky above, for the continuous low rumble of cannon fire that marks the return to a world where violence observes certain boundaries of scale and direction. The silence between bombardments, broken only by the cry of seabirds, welcomes you back like a familiar voice, and you stand upon the walls to let the wind cleanse the smell of the underground from your garments. The first major assault on 12 May was repulsed, and the cost of that repulse is written in the heaps of Ottoman dead that lie before the walls until the next darkness allows their comrades to retrieve them. You are standing at the harbour at dawn on the 13th of May, and the cold air moves across your face as you survey the field of yesterday's combat, the churned mud now marked with the irregular patterns of violence. The spring rains turning the siege lines to mud have made every attack a struggle against the ground itself, and you observe how the bodies have sunk into the earth, how it claims its due from the fallen with the same democratic indifference that it showed to the living. Mehmed offered terms of surrender after each failed assault, and these terms are conveyed by heralds who ride forward under flag of truce to speak of clemency and preservation. The defenders refused, knowing surrender meant death or slavery, and this knowledge binds the garrison together with a solidarity that no external pressure can break. You hear the terms discussed in low voices among the officers, the calculation of what survival might mean under Ottoman rule, and you hear the silence that follows when each man contemplates the fate of those who have already fallen into enemy hands. The 2,000 foreign mercenaries, mostly Genos and Venetian, are among the most vocal in their rejection of compromise, for they have the sea before them and the possibility of escape that the native defenders lack, yet they choose to remain to share the fate of the city that has paid for their service. The Ottoman army numbered approximately 80,000 men, and this number has not diminished in any meaningful way despite the thousands who have fallen before the walls. The second assault on 18 May also failed, and the pattern of the siege becomes clear in its terrible regularity. The defenders learn to take shelter in the deeper chambers of the towers while the stones rain upon the parapets, to emerge only when the silence between bombardments signals the transition to the next phase of combat. You are standing upon the walls when the Janissaries, elite infantry corps, advance in their ordered ranks, and the precision of their movement speaks of a discipline that matches the desperation of the defense. Something has hardened in the hearts of those who remain, a resignation that borders upon serenity, the acceptance of a role in history that transcends individual survival. The steady attrition has reached a point where every able body is pressed into service, where the distinction between soldier and citizen has dissolved in the common necessity of holding the walls. You see women upon the parapets carrying water and bandages, children gathering the spent arrows that can be returned to the enemy with new points of Christian iron. The taste of brackish water, carefully rationed, has become the taste of the siege itself, a constant reminder of the city's isolation from the sources of life that once flowed so freely through its harbors and aqueducts. The final assault was planned for the night of 28-29 May, and this knowledge spreads through the garrison with the speed of a religious revelation, a date fixed in the calendar of destruction that gives shape to the remaining hours. The final council of war in the emperor's chambers brings together the surviving leaders in a gathering that has the quality of a last communion, a sharing of bread and wine that acknowledges the end of earthly hope. You are not among those who enter that chamber, but you stand in the outer room where the servants wait, and you hear the murmur of voices through the heavy door, the cadences of argument and acceptance that have accompanied human communities to their ends since the beginning of time. The flicker of Greek fire in the mine shafts has ceased in recent days, for the underground war has reached a stalemate of exhaustion, both sides lacking the numbers and the spirit to continue their burrowing combat. The presence of Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn has transformed the strategic situation, removing the one advantage that sustained the defenders through the early weeks. The chain remains there still, a monument to ingenuity that has been outflanked by greater ingenuity, a barrier that has been bypassed rather than broken. The great bombards have wrought changes upon the walls that daily reduce the margin of survival. You walk the parapets in the hours before the final assault, and the rough stone beneath your palms is no longer the stone of your childhood memory, but a fractured, precarious structure that shudders with each distant report. The smell of damp wool and rusted mail mingles now with the sharper odors of powder and burned flesh, the chemistry of modern warfare that has transformed the ancient art of siege into something new and terrible. The spring rains have given way to the drier warmth of late May, yet the mud remains in the memory of the ground, a soft foundation that swallows the blood of the fallen with the same indifference that it showed to the living. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes no longer, for commerce has fled the city with the first bombardment, and the harbor holds only the vessels of war and the hulks of those that have been sunk to block the approach. The cold air moves across your face with a gentleness that seems almost deliberate, as if the season itself were offering a final kindness before the heat of summer brings its own miseries. The seabirds cry overhead, and in their ordinary voices you hear the persistence of life that will continue after the walls have fallen, after the 1,000-year history has reached its final page. In these last hours, something has shifted in the quality of that effect, a release from the anxiety of uncertainty into the peace of known ending. This refusal has carried them to the brink of the final night with a dignity that no defeat can diminish. You feel it in the quiet movements of the men around you, in the absence of panic or lamentation, in the acceptance of a role that history has assigned. The Ottoman campfires spread across the land like a field of stars fallen to earth, a galaxy of destruction that waits for the signal to advance. You know that the next hours will bring the greatest bombardment of all, the concentrated fury of every gun in the Ottoman arsenal poured upon the weakened sections of the wall. The silence between bombardments will be shorter now, the intervals of peace reduced to gasps between the blows. You descend from the parapet to take your assigned station, and the taste of brackish water rises once more to remind you of the body's persistence, its insistence upon attention even in the face of extinction. The blue of Greek fire returns to you now, a blue that seems to underlie the darkness itself, the blue of gas, flame, and distant lightning, and the last moment before sleep. You wait in the darkness with the others who have survived to this point, the remnant now perhaps half that number or less. The sound of janissary drums and voices carries across the no-man's land between the lines, a music of professional violence that announces the approach of the empire's finest. In the final assault, these divisions will merge into a single wave of flesh and iron, the historical antagonists of East and West, resolved into a common purpose of conquest. The underground war seems now like a preparation for the larger darkness that has enveloped the city, a rehearsal for the final act in a theater that has contracted to the dimensions of these walls. You think of the miners who still lie beneath the ground where Greek fire consumed them, their bodies preserved in the attitudes of combat, and you feel the earth itself as a presence that holds both the living and the dead in its indifferent embrace. The steady attrition has reached its terminus, and the dawn that approaches will reveal the result of all the dwindling, the final accounting of strength against strength that has been the algebra of these 53 days. The 2,000 foreign mercenaries stand among the native defenders in the darkness, their foreign voices raised in the same prayers and oaths that have sustained men in extremity since the first walls were built around the first settlement. Whatever their number now, they are sufficient for the role that history demands, sufficient to make the fall of the city an event worthy of memory rather than a mere capitulation. You feel the rough stone beneath your palms one last time as you take your position, and the cold air moves across your face with a freshness that seems to carry the scent of the sea, of distant harbors and mornings that will dawn without the sound of gunfire. The memories of successful resistance sustain you through the long minutes of waiting. The decisions of the final council move through the darkness in whispered commands, in the redistribution of the last reserves to the points of greatest danger. Now the bombardment begins again with a concentration that exceeds all previous experience, a continuous thunder that seems to merge with the beating of your own heart. The continuous low rumble of cannon fire establishes its rhythm of dread with a finality that admits no interruption, no hope of silence or surcease. You are standing upon the walls as the first wave emerges from the Ottoman trenches, and the darkness is suddenly alive with movement and voice, with the ancient sounds of assault that have not changed since the first siege engine was built against the first fortification. The dust of late may rises now to obscure the vision, to make every figure a shadow, every shadow a threat. The immediate odors of combat replace the settled smells of the camp, the sweat and terror, and the strange sweetness of adrenaline that accompanies the body's final mobilization. The chain stands there still, a useless guardian of a harbor that the enemy has already penetrated. Every engineering solution has found its corresponding problem, every defense its corresponding circumvention. The memory of that sunken ship rises now like a distant beacon, a moment of collective purpose that seems to belong to another age. The repulse of the naval attack echoes in the memory with a quality of innocence that the intervening weeks have destroyed. You hear no cheering now, only the ordered voices of officers and the ragged breathing of men who have reached the limit of their endurance. The taste of brackish water returns for a final time, and you swallow against a throat that has gone dry with the chemistry of fear. That night is now, the darkness that will determine whether the city stands or falls, whether the 1,000-year history continues or reaches its appointed terminus. In this ultimate moment, the psychology of the individual dissolves into the larger psychology of the group, the ancient mechanism by which men face death together with a courage that none could summon alone. You feel it forming around you, this collective will, and you surrender to it as the mind surrenders to sleep, as the body surrenders to the gravity that draws it always downward. The assault that follows this silence will be the last, the culmination of all the preparation and all the waiting. Around you, the defenders prepare themselves with the gestures that men have always used in the face of the unknown, the touching of amulets, the whispered names of mothers and distant homes, the final adjustments of belt and strap that serve to occupy the hands while the mind confronts its limit. The blue of Greek fire returns to your memory as a color against the darkness, a blue that seems to pulse with its own life, its own refusal to be extinguished. The underground war has prepared you for this larger darkness, this wider theater of final combat. There will be no more dawns for those who fall this night, and the number that survives will be determined by forces beyond any calculation. You feel the rough stone beneath your palms, and the cold air moves across your face, and the first light of the 29th of May begins to show upon the eastern horizon, a light that carries no promise of renewal, only the illumination of what has been decided in the darkness. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, and the great chain stretches across the mouth of the Golden Horn from Constantinople to Galata, its iron links heavy with dew and the accumulated rust of centuries. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of grain and dried fish, their movements unhurried, for the chain has held the sea safe since ancient times, and no fleet has ever passed its barrier. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the scent of brine and the distant smoke of morning cookfires from the Genos colony of Galata, where the hills rise gentle and wooded beyond the water. The chain prevented the Ottoman fleet from attacking the weaker sea walls, those lower fortifications that guard the harbor's edge, where the land meets the sea in crumbling limestone and patched mortar. The light changes gradually, the sky deepening to a clear pale blue that holds no promise of rain, and the water of the Golden Horn lies still as polished metal between its shores. The Genos colony of Galata did not intervene in the affairs of their neighbors, maintaining neutrality with the careful pragmatism of merchants who understood that empires rose and fell while trade endured. You can see their watchtowers from where you stand, wooden structures perched upon the higher ground, their flags hanging limp in the motionless air of early afternoon. The texture of the day is warmth held back by the season, a spring resistance that keeps the sun's full heat at bay, and the shadows of masts and rigging fall sharp upon the decks of the few Byzantine ships that still patrol the inner harbor. Around you, the merchants continue their unloading with the steady patience of those who have learned to move goods through blockaded waters, and the sound of their voices carries flat across the water indistinct words in half a dozen tongues. On the night of 22 April 1453, Mehmed ordered ships to be transported overland, a command that passed through his camp in whispers and low torchlit conferences, and you are standing now in darkness that has fallen complete across the Bosphorus. Surveyors marking the route through the Genos quarter moved with measured steps, their instruments catching the flame in brief gleams of brass and polished steel, and their footprints pressed into the soft earth of the hillside above Galata. Approximately 70 ships were moved on greased wooden rails, a number that seemed impossible when first spoken, and yet the timbers were already being shaped by carpenters who worked without rest through the preceding days. The smell of pine resin and animal fat from the greased rails rose thick in the darkness, a warm, organic scent that clung to clothing and skin, and you feel it now upon your own hands, the residue of substances prepared to reduce friction, to make possible what geography had forbidden. The first ship sliding from the water onto greased timbers made a sound like a drawn breath, the hull settling into its new element with a groan that seemed to come from deep within its structure. The groan of ship timbers twisting on the uneven ground became the continuous music of that night, as keel met rail and rail met earth, and the whole unwieldy mass began its slow procession through the hours. The creak of wood and low commands wove together into a rhythm that might have been mistaken for the ordinary sounds of a harbour at rest, had any listener been close enough to hear. You are moving with them now, placed among the haulers by the necessary magic of this telling, and the lowing of oxen, the crack of whips, shuffling in darkness surround you on all sides. The animals moved in teams of 12 and 16, their massive shoulders straining against harnesses of leather and iron, their hooves finding uncertain purchase on slopes made slick with the same grease that eased the ship's passage. The route went from the Bosphorus over the hill of Galata to the Golden Horn, and every rod of that distance had been measured by the surveyor's torches, every incline calculated for the stress it would place upon hull and hauling team alike. The ships were hauled by sailors, soldiers, and oxen teams, a labour that drew from every quarter of the Ottoman host, and you can feel the rope rough against your shoulder where you have taken your place in the line, the fibres biting through the cloth of your garment. The darkness is not complete here, for torches move in procession up the slope, and the red light catches the sweating flanks of the oxen, the strained faces of men who lean into their work with the knowledge that dawn will expose them all. The cold air moves across your face, but you are warm with exertion, and the smell of pine resin and animal fat from the greased rails rises stronger now as the friction of passage heats the timbers beneath the sliding keels. The slow procession through the night continues hour upon hour, and the moon has crossed from east to west unseen behind clouds that hold their moisture without releasing it. The Genos colony of Galata did not intervene, maintaining neutrality with the practiced ease of a people who had preserved their trading privileges through centuries of shifting power, and their windows remained dark, their doors barred, their prayers spoken in rooms where the sounds of the night could be mistaken for dream or delusion. The operation took from dusk until dawn, a span of hours that seemed to compress and expand according to the labourer's position in the line, those at the rear waiting through long periods of inactivity, while those at the front strained without pause. You are standing at the crest of the hill now, and the Bosphorus lies dark below to your left, the Golden Horn dark to your right, and the torches trace a winding path between them like a river of fire flowing uphill against nature. The lowing of oxen, the crack of whips, shuffling in darkness has become indistinguishable from your own breathing, your own heartbeat, and the ships pass one by one, their masts swaying with the unevenness of their support, their hulls black against the darker black of the wooded slopes. The defenders awoke to find Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn, and you are standing upon the sea walls as the first grey light begins to show in the east, as the morning mist rising from the water, revealing what had been concealed, begins to thin and drift apart. The dawn revelation, Ottoman banners seen from the sea walls where none had been, unfolds with the terrible clarity of a fever dream, and you feel the rough stone beneath your palms as you grip the parapet in disbelief. Around you, the merchants are not unloading their cargoes this morning, for the harbour has become a place of war, and the cold air moves across your face, carrying the distant sound of drums and the nearer sound of weeping. The morning mist continues to dissipate in ragged streamers, and the full extent of Mehmed's audacity becomes visible from your vantage. Approximately 70 ships rest upon the water where no Ottoman hull had ever floated, their masts bare of sail, but bristling with the threat of imminent use. The presence of the fleet in the Golden Horn demoralized the defenders, and you can feel that demoralization now, a physical weight upon the shoulders of the men who stand beside you, who had believed in the chain as they believed in the walls themselves, as guarantees against the impossible. The sea walls, lower than the land walls, now faced direct attack from vessels that could bring their guns to bear at point-blank range, and the patched mortar that had sufficed against distant bombardment would crumble under concentrated fire. The light changes gradually, the sky deepening to a color that holds no warmth, and the water of the Golden Horn shows the intruded fleet in sharp detail. The Venetian captain Giacomo Coco would die in a sortie against the Ottoman fleet, though that death lies some days ahead, and for now the defenders watch in stunned paralysis as the implications unfold. The move forced the Byzantine fleet to divide its forces, sending galleys to face this new threat, while maintaining watch upon the greater fleet that still lay beyond the chain. And you can hear the shouted orders, the confusion of priorities, the desperate calculus of insufficient ships against too many enemies. The texture of the day is shock held barely in check, a numbness that permits function without permitting comprehension, and the shadows of the new-arrived masts fall upon water that seems to you darker than it was before. On the night of 28 April, the desperate fire ship attack would be launched against the intruded fleet, and you are standing upon the sea walls as the preparations unfold in haste and partial secrecy. The Byzantines attempted to burn the Ottoman ships with fire ships, vessels loaded with combustibles and set adrift upon the current, their crews rowing them to position before igniting the cargo and escaping overboard. The sudden flare transforms the harbor into a theater of orange and black, the flames reflected in the dark water so that the burning seems to occur in two worlds at once, above and below. You feel the heat upon your face even at this distance, and the cold air moves across your features in strange alternation with the warm-up draft of the conflagration, and the crackle of burning timber is joined by shouts and the splintering of hulls as the fire finds its targets. The fire ship attack was partially successful, but failed to destroy the fleet, and you are watching as the flames die down, as the last of the Byzantine incendiaries drifts ashore or sinks with its cargo unignited. The sudden flare has consumed perhaps a dozen Ottoman vessels, has scattered others in panic, but the greater number remain, their crews having learned to fend off the attackers with long poles, to tow them clear with small boats, to accept some losses as the price of maintaining their position. The flames reflected in the dark water diminish to embers, to floating debris, to the ordinary darkness of a harbor night, and the smell of pine resin and animal fat from the greased rails seems to return, or perhaps it never left, having entered the water and the air itself. The groan of ship timbers is replaced by the gentler motion of vessels at anchor, by the creak of rigging in the night breeze that rises with the cooling of the land. The days that follow are days of adjustment, of new routines imposed by new realities, and you are standing upon the sea walls as the work progresses upon the shore opposite. Mehmed ordered a pontoon bridge built across the harbor, a structure of lashed boats and wooden planks that would connect his forces on both sides of the Golden Horn, and the construction proceeds with the methodical patience of those who have time on their side. The linking of the two arms of the siege unfolds across several days of labor, the boats brought into position and anchored against the current, the planks laid and secured, the whole tested by the passage of troops and artillery. You can see the progress from where you stand, the gap narrowing day by day, and the cold air moves across your face, carrying the sound of hammering and the shouted commands of engineers. The completion of the pontoon bridge arrives without ceremony on a morning when the mist lies heavy upon the water, and the first soldiers cross from the eastern shore to the western, from Asia to Europe, without wetting their boots. The bridge connected his forces on both sides of the Golden Horn, and the strategic isolation of the defenders was complete. Their harbor became a highway for their enemies. Their sea walls become front lines. The light changes gradually, the sky clearing to a pale blue that holds no particular promise, and the water of the Golden Horn shows the completed bridge in all its functional simplicity, a line of boats and planks that has changed the geometry of the siege. The operation demonstrated Mehmed's willingness to attempt the unprecedented, and that willingness now seems less a character trait than a method, a systematic refusal to accept the constraints that others had found absolute. It is one of the most celebrated engineering feats in military history, though the celebration would come later, in accounts written by those who survived to appreciate its significance. And for now it stands merely as fact, as the new condition within which all other facts must be understood. The texture of the day is resignation held at bay by the requirements of continued function, and the shadows of the bridge's supports fall upon water that carries the reflection of Ottoman banners, where no Ottoman banner had ever been reflected before. You are standing upon the sea walls at evening now, and the first stars show pale in the darkening east, and the lights of the Ottoman camp twinkle across the water and upon the hills beyond, a constellation of encirclement complete. The night deepens around you, and the water of the Golden Horn grows indistinct, a darkness upon which the lights of the fleet make small and scattered impressions. Around you, the merchants are not unloading their cargoes, for the harbour is closed to ordinary commerce, and the only traffic is military, the only movement that of preparations for assault. The dawn comes gradually, as dawns do in this season, and the morning mist rises again as it has risen each day since that first revelation. The impossibility now become ordinary, become the expected, become the foundation upon which new impossibilities might be built. The Venetian captain Giacomo Coco died in a sortie against the Ottoman fleet, and his death lies ahead in the narrative, or perhaps behind, the sequence of events having become as fluid as the water itself in this extended present of siege and survival. You are standing upon the sea walls at some hour of some day, and the water stretches before you to the shores where the enemy waits, and the bridge spans that water with its functional indifference, and the ships lie at anchor with their guns trained upon your position. The texture of the day is waiting without hope, functioning without expectation, and the shadows of the enemy masts move slowly across the water as the sun completes its arc. That willingness to attempt the unprecedented has been rewarded with success beyond any proportional calculation, the hill of Galata having yielded its passage as the walls of Constantinople may yet yield theirs. The night falls again, or perhaps it has never lifted, the sequence of days having become indistinguishable in the extended twilight of the siege's final phase. The sudden flare of fire ships, the crackle of burning timber has become memory, has entered the catalogue of failed attempts, of partial successes that changed nothing essential. The flames reflected in the dark water have cooled to embers, to ash, to the ordinary darkness of a harbour night that shows the enemy fleet still in possession, still threatening, still waiting for the moment of final assault. You are standing upon the sea walls, and the water stretches before you, and the bridge spans it, and the ships lie upon it, and all of this has become the world as it is, the world as it will be until the end that approaches with its own inexorable patience, its own refusal to be hurried or delayed. The morning comes, or does not come, and you remain upon the walls, and the cold air moves across your face, and the smell of pine resin and animal fat from the greased rails has become a memory so distant it might be invention. Yet the ships remain, and the bridge remains, and the siege remains, and the hill of Galata remains marked with the ruts of that impossible passage, the earth still bearing the impress of what was moved across it in darkness, in silence, in the lowing of oxen, and the crack of whips, and the shuffling of feet upon ground made slick with the substances of friction and ease. The operation took from dusk until dawn, and the dawn that followed revealed what the darkness had accomplished, and every dawn since has revealed the same, the impossibility made ordinary, the unprecedented become routine. the world altered by the passage of ships across a hill, by the labor of sailors, soldiers, and oxen teams, by the grease of pine resin and animal fat, by the determination of Mehmed who ordered it done upon the night of 22 April 1453, and by whose command the ships moved overland from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn, and by whose command they remain there still, and by whose command the end approaches with the certainty of gravity, with the patience of water, with the inevitability of all things that have been set in motion and will not be stopped until their completion. The great doors of Hagia Sophia opened slowly upon the evening of 28 May 1453, and you are standing among the crowd that gathers in the fading light, your hand upon the cool bronze of the doorframe that Emperor Justinian, the first, caused to be set here more than 9 centuries past, between 532 and 537 CD, when the world was younger and the empire seemed eternal. Around you, the people of Constantinople press forward, their faces pale with hunger and vigil, their garments worn thin by months of siege, and the air that moves across your face carries the last warmth of a spring day that will not come again. The harbor lies distant behind you, where ships once brought grain from Egypt and wine from the islands, and where now the fleet of Mehmed waits in patient blockade, and where the vessels that crossed the hills upon the night of 22 April 1453 still ride at anchor in the Golden Horn, their sails furled, their crews sleeping before the morrow's work. The vastness of the interior unfolds before you like the held breath of a giant, and your footsteps echo upon marble floors that have borne the weight of emperors since 641 CE, when first a Byzantine ruler was crowned beneath this dome of 33 meters, the largest brick dome ever erected on only 4 supports, a marvel that the architects Anthemius and Isidore raised for Justinian I, who wished to surpass Solomon's temple and all the works of Rome. Coolness rises from the stone, a coolness that has lived in these walls through summer heat and winter siege, through centuries of liturgy and the murmur of 10,000 prayers, and you feel it settle into your bones as you move forward with the press of the faithful. The scent of myrrh and frankincense drifts through the nave, not the thin smoke of household devotion, but the heavy, resinous weight of cathedral incense, settling upon brocade vestments and upon the dust that has gathered in corners unswept, since servants grew too few or too weak for their tasks. Above you, the dome arches across the darkness like a second sky inverted, its pale gold surface catching the lamplight in trembling pools that seem to breathe with the movement of flame, and the Mosaic Christ Pantocrator looks down from the eastern arch with eyes of tesserid glass that appear to shift and follow as you walk beneath. You are not alone in this perception. Around you, others pause and glance upward, their own faces momentarily stilled by the illusion of movement in stillness, by the ancient craft that made stone and glass seem alive with presence. The Theotokos, Mother of God, looks down upon the congregation from her ancient mosaic in the apse, her face serene beneath the gold leaf that has darkened slightly with 9 centuries of candle smoke and incense, and her gaze seems to encompass not only the gathered faithful, but the city beyond these walls, the walls that have held against so many assaults and will hold, or fail, upon the morrow. The emperor enters through the great doors that Justinian I caused to be made, and he enters not as sovereign, but as penitent, his purple boots silent upon the marble that has known the tread of 60 emperors crowned in this place since 641 CE, in this cathedral of Constantinople that has been the religious center of Orthodox Christianity and the symbol of the Byzantine imperial idea, the navel of the world around which all creation was understood to turn. You see him pass, and his face is the color of old parchment, hollowed by fasting and by sleepless nights upon the walls, and his crown sits lightly upon his brow as though it were already a relic, already an object for future centuries to wonder at. He does not look to left or right, but moves toward the ambo with the step of a man who has set down his burden and awaits only the judgment that follows. And around him, the nobles and the priests make way with gestures that seem less of courtesy than of farewell. The weight of incense, myrrh and frankincense settles upon your shoulders like a mantle as you find your place among the standing faithful, and the distant murmur of the city beyond the great doors grows faint, stilled by the gathering of prayer that draws all sound inward toward the center of this space that has held the liturgy of the hours for 900 years and more. You are standing at the harbor of the Spirit now, in the place that has been the navel of the world since Justinian I completed his great church, and the cool vastness of the interior seems to expand with each breath you draw, as though the building itself were breathing, as though the dome were the diaphragm of some sleeping god. Footsteps echo and are swallowed by the height above, by the darkness that gathers in the galleries where once the Empress and her ladies watched unseen, and where now perhaps a few remaining souls lean upon the marble parapet to look down upon this final gathering. Lamplight flickers across the gold mosaics that have been the wonder of travelers from distant lands, and the pale gold of the dome in lamplight seems to pulse with a life borrowed from flame, the mosaic Christ seeming to move in the shifting illumination as though he were present not in symbol, but in substance, as though the boundary between representation and reality had grown thin with the exhaustion of the city, with the nearness of the end that all have felt approaching since the ships moved overland upon the night of 22 April 1453. The scent of myrrh drifts thicker now, and with it the sweetness of aged wood and the faint mineral tang of the marble itself, the stone that has been quarried from distant mountains and brought by ship and ox cart to raise this temple that would outlast empires, that would see the faith that built it transformed and yet endure. You feel the coolness of the floor through the thin leather of your shoes, and the sensation seems to connect you to all who have stood here, to the coronations and the funerals, to the anathemas and the triumphs, to the ordinary Sundays when the city was at peace and the liturgy rose like breathing through the hours of mourning. The first hymn begins, and voices that have sung these words since childhood find the ancient melodies with a certainty that needs no thought, with a muscle memory deeper than conscious mind. And yet the sound is thin against the vast dome, the architectural miracle that has made this space both intimate and overwhelming, both sheltering and exposing. You are standing among the congregation as the voices rise, and the sound seems to ascend not toward the dome itself, but toward something beyond it, toward the darkness that waits above the lamplight, toward the God who has been invoked here since Justinian I first entered in triumph upon the completion of his great work. The emperor kneels now, and according to later accounts, he will receive communion and ask forgiveness in the hours that follow, though you cannot see this from where you stand, can only know it by the hush that falls upon the clergy around the sanctuary, by the cessation of movement that marks a moment held apart from time. The distant sound of the Ottoman camp reaches you faintly through the great doors that stand open still upon the evening of 28 May 1453, a sound of voices and of movement, of preparations for the assault that will come with the dawn, and this sound mingles with the prayers in a way that seems neither discordant nor harmonious, but simply true, simply the condition of this hour in which the sacred and the martial have become inseparable. The building is silent, but for the prayers and this distant murmur, and the silence between phrases of the liturgy seems to have weight and texture, seems to press upon your ears with the same insistence as the incense presses upon your nostrils, the same fullness as the cool vastness of the interior presses upon your skin. You are standing at the harbour of faith, at the navel of the world, and the world itself seems to have narrowed to this point, to this last divine liturgy in the church as a Christian cathedral, this final service that will not be repeated, that will pass into memory, and then into legend, and then into the dry accounts of historians who will try and fail to recover what was felt here. The pale gold of the dome in lamplight catches your eye again, and the Mosaic Christ seems to bend his gaze toward the penitent emperor, toward the faithful who have gathered for this last time beneath the span of 33 meters that has defined the possibilities of sacred architecture for centuries to come, that will profoundly influence Ottoman mosque design, especially the work of Sinan, the great architect who will study this space and learn from its proportions, from its light, from the way that stone and brick can be made to float above emptiness. You do not know this future, standing here upon the evening of 28 May 1453, but the building seems to know it, seems to contain within its fabric all the transformations that await. The mihrab that will be oriented toward Mecca, slightly off the building's central axis, the minarets that will be added later by subsequent sultans, the bells that will be taken down, the Christian insignia and furnishings that will be removed or plastered over. The building contains its own future as it contains your present, as it contains the past of Justinian I and the architects who served him. The weight of incense has grown so familiar now that you no longer notice it as scent, but as atmosphere, as the medium through which you breathe and move. And yet, when a fresh sensing begins, the smoke rises visible in the lamplight, a column of grey that ascends toward the dome and disperses, that seems to carry the prayers with it toward the Mosaic Christ who looks down from the eastern arch. The Theotokos looks down upon the congregation from her ancient mosaic in the apse, and her face seems to hold a sorrow that was not there before, or that you had not seen before, the sorrow of a mother who knows the fate of her children, who has known it since before their birth, and will know it after their death. You are standing among those children now, and the cool vastness of the interior seems to enfold you not as shelter, but as witness, as the stone and glass and gold that will remain when you have passed, that will see what you will not see, that will endure in forms transformed but undestroyed. A final hymn rises, and the voices are thinner now, not from weariness alone, but from the weight of what is ending, from the knowledge that this melody, these words, this gathering in this form will not come again, that the Cathedral of Constantinople, the religious center of Orthodox Christianity, will serve other purposes, will be other things, will become a mosque from 1453 until 1935, a museum from 1935 to 2020, and then converted back to a mosque in 2020, its identity shifting with the centuries while its stones remain, while the dome continues to arch above the faithful of whatever faith. You are standing at the last liturgy, and the sound of voices seems to reach toward the dome and fall back, to rise again and fall like the breathing of a sleeper, like the tide against walls that will not hold forever, like all things that have been set in motion and will not be stopped until their completion. The emperor receives communion, and according to later accounts, he asks forgiveness, though from your place in the congregation you see only the stillness that falls upon the sanctuary, the moment of transformation that passes between priest and penitent, between the representative of Christ and the representative of an empire that has lasted 11 centuries and will end with the dawn. The building is silent, but for the prayers and the distant sound of the Ottoman camp, and in this silence you feel the first grey of dawn beginning at the windows, a lightening that is not yet light, that promises nothing but the continuation of what has begun, the assault that will come with the sun, the transformation that will follow upon the assault. The cross still crowned above the great doors, and you look upon it with a gaze that tries to fix it in memory, to hold it against the forgetting that comes with exhaustion, with trauma, with the simple passage of years that will make this night one among many, remarkable only to those who lived it, incomprehensible to those who will read of it in later times. The dispersal begins, and the people move toward the great doors that Justinian I caused to be made, that have opened for the last time upon this service, and will not open again for this purpose, will open instead for other rites, for the prayers of another faith, for the curiosity of travelers, and the scholarship of archaeologists, and the devotion of the faithful who will come after. You move with them, and your footsteps echo upon marble floors that have known the tread of emperors and penitents, of conquerors and scholars, of the ordinary faithful who came seeking what the building offered, the sense of presence, the navel of the world that made all places else peripheral, all journeys else incomplete. The cool vastness of the interior releases you gradually, and the air that moves across your face at the threshold carries the sense of the city, of smoke and fear, and the distant harbor where the ships that crossed the hills still wait, where the end approaches with the certainty of gravity, with the patience of water, with the inevitability of all things that have been set in motion. Each to their station on the walls, the dispersal into the dark streets, and you move among them through passages that have grown familiar with months of siege, through the quarter where your own post awaits, where the stones are cool with night, and the sky above the narrow way shows the first stars fading before the coming grey. The distant murmur of the city, stilled by prayer, now rises again in other forms, the sound of footsteps, of whispered farewells, of weapons being checked and positions confirmed, and beneath it all the deeper silence that has fallen upon Hagia Sophia, the silence of a building that has completed its purpose as a Christian cathedral, that has held its last divine liturgy and will hold no more, that will become something else, that already is something else in the minds of those who will transform it. You do not look back, cannot look back, for the press of bodies moves you forward, and the hour demands your presence elsewhere, demands that you become part of the defense that will fail or hold, that will become legend or footnote, that will be remembered or forgotten according to the whims of historians and the needs of nations yet unborn. The silence that followed before the final assault, and you are standing upon the wall now, and the cool stone beneath your palms has grown familiar as your own skin, and the darkness beyond shows the campfires of the Ottoman host spread across the plain, and along the shore of the Golden Horn like a second constellation fallen to earth, like the mirror of the stars above. The first grey of dawn through the windows of the city, though you cannot see them from here, reaches you as a general lightning, as a breath held and released, and you know that in Hagia Sophia the darkness still holds, that the building is silent but for the settling of embers, the cooling of stone, the gradual equalization of temperature that will make the interior indistinguishable from the morning outside. The scent of incense has left your garments now, or you have grown so accustomed to it that you no longer perceive it as separate from yourself, and the smell of the wall replaces it, the mineral tang of old mortar, the organic smell of the earthworks piled against the inner face, the faint sweetness of disturbed soil. The distant murmur of the city, stilled by prayer, has given way to the more particular sounds of preparation, of whispered commands, of the creak of bowstrings being tested, and the soft clink of mail. You are standing at your station, and the navel of the world seems distant now, seems to have receded into the night that is ending, into the past that is already becoming memory, already becoming story, already becoming the material from which later ages will construct their understanding of what it meant to be Byzantine, to be Orthodox, to be part of an empire that ended here, upon these walls, upon this dawn. The pale gold of the dome has faded to darkness now, the lamps extinguished or burned out, the Mosaic Christ, and the Theotokos looking down upon emptiness, upon the space that has held the last congregation and will hold the next, whoever they may be, of whatever faith, drawn by the fame of the building that Justinian I raised between 532 and 537 CE, by the wonder of the dome of 33 meters, the largest brick dome ever erected on only 4 supports. You are standing at the end of something, and the beginning of something else is not yet visible, is not yet imaginable, for the assault will come first, the conquest, the removal of Christian insignia and furnishings, the taking down of bells, the conversion into the principal mosque of the Ottoman Empire, and only after centuries of that will the other transformations come, the museum years from 1935 to 2020, the reversion in 2020, the ongoing life of a building that has contained multitudes, that has been the navel of the world for many worlds in succession. The first sound of the assault reaches you across the water, across the walls, a distant thunder that is not thunder, and you feel the stone beneath your palms vibrate with the energy of thousands moving as one, with the engines that have been built, and the ladders that have been prepared, and the determination of Mehmed, who ordered all things done, who ordered the ships overland upon the night of 22 April 1453, who orders this final push with the certainty of gravity, with the patience of water, with the inevitability of all things that have been set in motion and will not be stopped until their completion. You are standing at the last liturgy, though the liturgy has ended, standing in the silence that followed before the final assault, and the cool air moves across your face with the promise of a day that will transform everything, that will complete what began long before your birth and will continue long after your death, in this building that has been and will be the navel of the world, Hagia Sophia, the wisdom of God, the last liturgy and the first of whatever comes after. The night of 28 May 1453 passes through the palace at Blashany, like a current of dark water moving through a channel that has no end. You are standing in the corridors where lamps burn low and shadows gather in the vaulted corners, and the cold air moves across your face from windows that face the Golden Horn. Constantine the 11th Palaiologos, who became emperor in 1449, moves through these spaces without the retinue that once attended an emperor of the Romans, his footsteps alone on the marble that his predecessors walked. The weight of what approaches settles upon the city like a hand upon a sleeping chest, pressing the breath from those who wait. Around you, the palace holds its silence, a silence built from 14th century stone and from the accumulated stillness of rooms where decisions have hardened into history. The grey half-light before dawn begins to stain the eastern sky above the Bosphorus, and shapes moving without colour resolve gradually from the darkness on the water. You are standing at a window that overlooks the harbour, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular salt of the sea that has carried the fleets of many empires to this threshold. The smell of the assault, smoke and blood, and the salt of the sea, rises already from the walls where fires have burned through the night, where the Ottoman guns have maintained their rhythm of destruction against the ancient fortifications. The ships of the blockade sit upon the water like instruments of patience, their crews waiting for the signal that will release them into the final act of this siege. Constantine the 11th Palaiologos, the last reigning Roman emperor in an unbroken line from Augustus, has not slept, and you sense his wakefulness as a presence in the building, a current of consciousness moving against the tide of exhaustion that pulls at every defender. In the chamber where the imperial regalia has been kept, the emperor stands before those symbols that have conveyed authority across more than 1,000 years of Roman rule. You are standing in the doorway, though you are not seen, and the cold air moves across your face from a passage that leads to the gardens where no one walks tonight. The purple boots lie upon a chest, their dye dark, as the wine of the region that once supplied Constantinople with its sacramental drink. The crown rests beside them, and the chain of office, and the cloak that has marked the difference between a man and an institution. Constantine the 11th reportedly removed his imperial insignia before the final assault, and the gesture carries through the silence of this room like a sentence spoken in a language that requires no translation. Around you, the textures of embroidered silk and worked metal hold the lamplight in patterns that have witnessed the coronation of emperors who ruled when the world was otherwise arranged. The walk through the streets to the walls takes the emperor past houses where families press together in the darkness, past churches where candles burn before icons that have received the prayers of generations. You are standing in the street as he passes, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a city that has exhausted its stores of hope, and now operates upon something more durable, something closer to stone than to flesh. The soldiers recognize him as he moves among them, and their recognition passes through the ranks in a wave of gestures that require no words, salutes half-formed and hands pressed to hearts. Constantine the 11th Palaiologos commanded a garrison of 7,000 to 10,000 against 80,000 besiegers, and the arithmetic of this disproportion has been present in every mind through these final weeks. Yet he refused to flee the city when escape was still possible, and this refusal has entered the realm of the already legendary, even as the events themselves continue to unfold. The gate of St. Romanos in the Mesotician rises before you as the sky begins its slow transformation from black to the grey that precedes colour. You are standing at the fortifications, where the wall has been battered into a profile of broken teeth, and the cold air moves across your face with the smoke of fires that have been maintained against the possibility of night attack. The emperor took his position at this gate, and around him, the men who will form the nucleus of the final defense gather in patterns that have been determined by exhaustion and by the habits of military order. The crash of the gate giving way, splinters flying, has not yet occurred, but the anticipation of this sound lives in every ear, a future noise that occupies the present like a weight upon a stretched membrane. The smell of the assault intensifies as the wind shifts and brings the Ottoman lines into sensory proximity. The first hours of 29 May 1453 arrive without ceremony, their passage marked only by the incremental brightening of a sky that remains determinedly colourless. You are standing upon the wall where the emperor has positioned himself, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular chill of a morning that will not warm. The final Ottoman assault began in these early hours, and the massed movement of the besiegers resolves gradually from the grey half-light, shapes moving without colour across the broken ground that separates the armies. The Janissaries advance in their ordered ranks, their white caps visible even in this light as a kind of negative space against the darker mass of their clothing. The guns have fallen silent, their work of demolition completed, and into the space of this silence, the human sounds of advance pour like water into a vessel that has been emptied. The first Janissaries over the parapet arrive as a consequence of the breach at the gate of Kirkaporta, where the defenders have been too few to hold the integrity of the wall against the concentrated pressure of the assault. You are standing where the fighting has become most intense, and the cold air moves across your face with the heat of exertion and the particular temperature of blood exposed to morning air. The breach widens as more of the elite troops gain the wall, their discipline maintaining order even in the chaos of this breakthrough. The cold weight of a sword hilt in a gloved hand passes through your own grip as you understand, through the mechanism of immersive placement, the physical reality of what it means to stand in this position. Around you, The defenders who have not fallen press backward, step by step, their retreat dictated by the geometry of the collapsing position. The emperor is said to have said farewell to his closest companions in the moments before the final gathering of his guard, and these words, unrecorded in their exact form, have passed into the realm of what might have been spoken, what should have been spoken, what the dignity of the occasion demands. You are standing at the edges of this group, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a space where men have accepted the terms of their ending. The swords drawn from their scabbards catch what light the grey morning provides, and the sound of steel upon steel begins to dominate the auditory field, replacing the earlier percussion of artillery with the more intimate music of hand-to-hand combat. Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, stands among these men not as emperor now, but as soldier, the insignia he removed having completed its work of transformation. The final gathering of the emperor's guard forms in the space where the wall has been most severely compromised, a knot of determined figures in a field of movement that tends overwhelmingly toward their dissolution. You are standing within this formation, and the cold air moves across your face with the smell of the assault, now concentrated into a single overwhelming presence that admits no distinction among its components. The crash of the gate giving way recurs in the middle distance as another section of fortification yields to the pressure of the attack. The emperor led a final charge into the Ottoman lines, and this movement, when it comes, carries the quality of a wave that has been held back by a barrier that has finally dissolved, a release of accumulated force into the channel that awaits it. The charge into the grey light carries you forward with the mass of those who follow the emperor's lead, and the cold weight of a sword hilt in a gloved hand becomes the central fact of your physical existence, the anchor that connects intention to action in this moment of maximum exertion. You are moving through the half-light, shapes resolving into the figures of enemies, and then dissolving again into the general chaos of close combat. The cold air moves across your face with the passage of your own movement, the wind of velocity superimposed upon the wind of morning. Then the silence comes, the sudden silence where the emperor stood, then the roar of the victors, and in this sequence the auditory world reorganizes itself around an absence that is not yet understood, but will be understood in the moments that follow. The fighting in the streets continued for hours after the walls were breached, and you are standing in a passage where the sound of combat moves like weather, now approaching, now receding, never entirely absent. The cold air moves across your face with the smoke of burning buildings, a new component in the smell of the assault that marks the transition from siege to sack. Thousands of defenders and civilians were killed or enslaved, and the arithmetic of this catastrophe accumulates in the streets where you move, past figures that no longer move, past others who move without purpose or destination, the mechanisms of flight and pursuit having broken down into something more chaotic. The sack lasted for 3 days according to Ottoman custom, and this duration stretches before the city like a sentence pronounced in a language that the condemned must learn to understand. The day of 29 May 1453, Tuesday, passes into its afternoon and evening with the slow transformation of a defeated city into a repository of plunder. You are standing in a street that leads toward the center, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a place where the normal transactions of urban life have been suspended and replaced by the transactions of violence. The grey half-light before dawn has long since been replaced by a daylight that has witnessed everything and changed nothing, a sun that illuminates without distinguishing. Around you, the crash of doors giving way, the splintering of domestic barricades, replaces the crash of gates as the victorious troops move through the quarters that have not yet been emptied of their movable wealth. The night that follows the fall of the city brings a darkness that seems almost deliberate, a restoration of the cover that daylight had removed from the scenes of conquest. You are standing in a space that has been emptied, and the cold air moves across your face with the smell of the assault, now layered with the additional components of a city that has been unmade. The shapes moving without color in the darkness are those of victors moving among their acquisitions, of survivors attempting to navigate a transformed geography, of the dead lying in the positions that their final moments have determined. The morning of 30 May arrives with a clarity that seems almost offensive in its indifference to what has occurred. Mehmed entered the city on this morning and rode to Hagia Sophia, and his entrance carries the quality of a claim being made upon a space that has been emptied of its previous meaning. The emperor's body was never definitively identified among the dead, and this absence creates a particular resonance in the morning, a space of uncertainty that the victor's progress cannot entirely fill. Mehmed II is said to have searched for the body but could not find it, and this search, conducted in the hours or days that followed the fall, represents an acknowledgement of the symbolic importance that the corpse of the last emperor would have held. The great church rises before you as you move with the progress of the conqueror's party, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a space that has been and will be transformed. Mehmed ordered the building to be protected from further looting, and this order, carried by messengers through the streets, represents the first gesture of a new administration toward the institutions it has inherited. You are standing in the narthex, where the liturgy you once attended has been replaced by a different form of observance, and the grey half-light before dawn that once preceded the final assault has been replaced by the full light of a morning that knows nothing of what preceded it. The shapes moving without color within the great dome are those of men establishing the terms of a new presence in this space that has witnessed so many transformations. The end of the Byzantine Empire marked the definitive rise of the Ottoman Empire to great power status, and this historical judgment, delivered from the perspective of centuries, settles upon the scene with the weight of inevitability. You are standing in the church that has become, in this moment, something other than what it was, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a space where the past has been suspended and the future not yet articulated. Later legend claimed Constantine XI was turned to marble and would return to reclaim the city, and this legend, born from the absence of a body and the need for continuance, moves through the culture that has been defeated like a current beneath the surface of a still pool. The emperor was very probably killed during this last assault, and this probability, admitted even by those who have preserved the marble legend, anchors the narrative in a death that cannot be denied even where its exact circumstances remain obscure. The hours of 30 may progress through their ordinary sequence, and you are standing in the streets where the transformation of ownership continues its methodical advance. The cold air moves across your face with the smell of the assault, now beginning to dissipate as the fires are extinguished and the wind shifts to carry other information. The crash of the gate giving way has become memory, has become the material from which narrative will be constructed in the months and years that follow. The final charge into the Ottoman lines recedes into the past with the steady motion of all completed actions, and you are standing at a distance from the walls where this movement originated, in a space where the consequences of that charge continue to accumulate. The sudden silence where the emperor stood, then the roar of the victors, has become the template for understanding what occurred, the auditory signature of a transition that has been variously interpreted. The grey half-light before dawn has been replaced by the full light of afternoon, in which the victor's arrangements proceed without the ambiguity of partial visibility. Around you, The city that has been and will be Constantinople, that has been and will be Istanbul, continues its existence in a present that has absorbed the shock of transformation and now moves forward with the steady pulse of ongoing time. The days that follow the 3 days of sack bring a gradual restoration of order, and you are standing in a street where the debris has been pushed to the sides to allow passage. The cold air moves across your face with a quality that belongs to late spring, to the season that has contained these events and will continue into a summer that knows nothing of what preceded it. Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, has passed into the realm of those who will be remembered, and the manner of that memory will be contested across the centuries that follow. The legend of the Marble Emperor persists in the spaces where the defeated population gathers, in the churches that continue their observance under new arrangements, in the oral traditions that preserve what official record cannot accommodate. You are standing in a courtyard where men speak in low voices, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a space where hope has been transformed into something more durable, more capable of endurance. The emperor reportedly removed his imperial insignia before the final assault, and this removal, understood in the context of the legend, becomes a gesture of preparation for a different kind of presence, a translation from the mortal to the enduring. The last reigning Roman emperor in an unbroken line from Augustus has become, in this telling, something other than mortal, something that awaits the propitious moment for return. The weeks and months that follow the fall of 29 May 1453 bring their gradual normalization, and you are standing in a market where the transactions of commerce have resumed their ancient patterns. The cold air moves across your face with the ordinary smells of produce and animals and human presence, the smell of the assault now entirely replaced by the chemistry of daily living. The shapes moving without color in the early morning have become the shapes of merchants and customers, of the city returning to the rhythms that siege had interrupted. The gate of St. Romanos in the Mesotician stands in its broken condition, a monument to what occurred, while around it the life of the city continues in its persistent fashion, the human capacity for continuation asserting itself against the weight of memory. The years pass, and the centuries, and you are standing in a city that has accumulated the layers of its subsequent history upon the foundations of what was. The cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a place where many temporalities coexist, where the present moment is thick with the residue of moments that have preceded it. The fall of the city occurred on Tuesday, 29 May 1453, and this date, fixed in the calendars of multiple traditions, continues to generate observance and memory. The Janissaries broke through at the gate of Kirkaporta, and this breakthrough, understood in retrospect, has become one of the decisive moments in the long narrative of how the world came to be arranged as it is. The silence that surrounds the emperor's death, the absence of a body that could be identified and mourned, continues to generate its particular resonance. You are standing in a space where this silence seems almost audible, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a place where something remains unfinished, where the ordinary procedures of conclusion have been suspended. The narrative of what happened to Constantine the 11th Palaiologos has been told and retold, and you are standing in the presence of this retelling, in a space where the accumulated versions of events press upon the present moment like the weight of water upon a submerged hull. Yet the body was never definitively identified among the dead, and this absence creates the space in which the marble legend can take root and flourish. The final charge, the silence, the roar of the victors, these elements have arranged themselves into a pattern that repeats across the tellings, and you are standing in the presence of this pattern, in a space where the particular has been transformed into the archetypal. The crash of the gate giving way has become a sound that belongs to the imagination, that can be heard in the reading of texts that describe what cannot be directly recovered. The smell of the assault has been preserved in the chemistry of description, in the power of words to evoke what time has dissolved. You are standing in a city that embodies this transformation, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a place where the consequences of a single morning have been extended across the entire subsequent course of events. The night falls upon the city that has been the scene of these events, and you are standing in a space where the darkness seems to gather the past into itself, to hold the accumulated weight of what has been described. The emperor's last night, sleep impossible in the palace, has found its echo in this night that now surrounds you, in this darkness that presses upon the eyelids with the gentle insistence of what must come. The story of what happened to Constantine the 11th has been told to its conclusion, and you are standing in the space that follows this telling, where the words have done their work and now recede into the silence from which they came. The silence extends, and you are standing in it, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a space where the narrative has completed its work, and now yields to the deeper silence that precedes and follows all human speaking. The shapes moving without color have resolved into the shapes of darkness itself, into the undifferentiated field from which morning will eventually retrieve them, but not yet. Not in this moment that belongs to the interval, to the space between what has been told and what remains to be dreamed. The city that has been and will be Constantinople, that has been and will be Istanbul, holds its breath beneath the stars that have witnessed its transformation, and you are standing in this held breath, in this pause that precedes the resumption of time's ordinary passage, until the darkness completes its work, and the first light begins, imperceptibly, to separate itself from the horizon that waits beyond the sea. You are standing at the harbour at dawn in the year 1453, and the air carries the dry scent of dust from streets that have not yet awakened. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, but among the barrels of grain and the bales of cloth, other bundles move with greater care. The Byzantine scholars are packing their manuscripts in the days before the siege, and some foresight among the learned has guided their hands through the long night. The dry crackle of parchment being unrolled after centuries fills the quiet spaces between their whispered consultations. You feel the weight of a codex in the hands of a man who pauses to wrap it in oiled linen, his fingers tracing the roughness of leather binding that has survived 800 years since the scriptorium of an earlier age. The light is the color of old silver, the light that precedes true morning in a city where the Bosphorus breathes its cool exhale across the marble shores. Constantinople rises behind you in its last completeness, the great churches still holding their lamps against the dark, the walls that Theodosius built still standing in their monumental patience. The Byzantine Empire had preserved classical Greek and Roman knowledge through the medieval period, and now that preservation must become flight. Byzantine scholars had maintained libraries of ancient manuscripts in the monasteries of the Studian and the halls of the Patriarchate, in private houses where the accumulated breath of centuries had seasoned the air with the particular density of stored thought. You watch a scholar wrap a volume of Plato's dialogues, the pages so thin that the light passes through the Greek letters like messages written on skin. The smell of ink and dust in a Venetian library, water lapping below, is still unknown to these men, but they carry the premonition of it in the bundles they secure with cord. The harbour at dawn fills with the soft sounds of preparation, with the particular melancholy of departure that knows itself to be permanent. The last sight of the great city burning will come to these men in dreams for the remaining decades of their lives. But now, they see only the ordinary light on ordinary stone, the fishermen pushing their boats into water that shows no sign of what approaches. A man ties a label to a trunk in a script you cannot read, and the label names contents that have no price in any market. Manuscripts of Aristotle's metaphysics, of Ptolemy's astronomy, of the church fathers whose arguments shaped the contours of belief itself. The Byzantine contribution was particularly important for the recovery of Plato's works, and those works now rest in wooden boxes that smell of pine resin and urgency. The voyage across the Aegean begins without ceremony, the ships slipping from the Golden Horn into waters that have carried traffic since before history learned to record itself. You are standing at the rail of a merchant vessel, and the salt spray catches the light in fine particles that dissolve before they reach your skin. The last sight of the great city burning comes not as flame, but as absence, as the gradual diminishment of familiar shapes against the horizon until Constantinople becomes a line, becomes a point, becomes the memory of a place that still stands but will not stand for long. The scholars do not speak of what they have left, or what they carry, or what awaits them in the harbors of the West. The dry crackle of parchment being unrolled after centuries is replaced by the creak of timbers and the snap of canvas, by the endless negotiation of a wooden hull with the living water. The weight of a codex in the hands of a sleeping man below deck serves as ballast more reliable than any stone, the roughness of leather binding pressing against his chest, as if the book itself sought the protection of his heartbeat. The sea changes color as the days pass, from the deep green of the Propontis to the brighter blue of open water, and the air loses the particular density of the Bosphorus, that narrow channel where the currents run contrary and the winds dispute their directions. You feel the change in your lungs, in the quality of thirst, in the taste of bread that dries differently when the humidity withdraws. The arrival in Venice, the damp lagoon air after the dry Bosphorus, comes as a sensation first and a geography second, the nostrils filling with the mingled smells of low tide and seaweed, of wood permanently wet and stone permanently stained. The Byzantine scholars had maintained libraries of ancient manuscripts in a climate of dry summers, and now they must learn the particular chemistry of preservation in a city where water owns the ground and the buildings rise from it like arguments against the inevitable. The gulls cry in a different accent here, and the boats are shaped to different purposes, and the light falls through cloud in patterns that the painters will eventually learn to record with a patience these scholars can only approach through their own medium of the copied word. The humanist movement in Italy was already underway before 1453, and its practitioners move through the same streets, attend the same churches, breathe the same damp air, but they have not yet touched the manuscripts that travel in the scholars' trunks. The arrival of Byzantine scholars accelerated the transmission of Greek learning, and that acceleration begins in the practical negotiations of arrival, in the finding of rooms, in the establishment of routines that will permit the slow work of introduction and translation. You are standing in a narrow street where the water rises at certain tides to cover the lowest steps, and a man passes you carrying a box that requires both arms, his eyes lowered to the cobbles that threaten his balance. The quiet of a Florentine study, distant bells, and the scholar bending to his work is still months or years away for this traveler, but the box contains the materials from which that quiet will eventually be composed. Cardinal Bessarion was a prominent refugee who brought his library to Venice, and his name moves through the conversations of the learned with the particular resonance of a man who understood the value of what he carried before the carrying became necessary. He had been a scholar in Constantinople, had read Plato in the original Greek, while the city still held its confidence, and his collection represented the deliberate gathering of a lifetime informed by taste and theological conviction. The legal and philosophical heritage of Rome was also transmitted through Byzantine copies, and Bessariion's library contained works of Roman law alongside the dialogues that questioned law's ultimate foundations. You see him in imagination, a figure moving through the corridors of a palace that has not yet received his bequest, the weight of a codex in his hands as he considers its placement among the others, the roughness of leather binding familiar to his fingers as the texture of his own skin. He bequeathed his collection to the Republic of Venice in 1468, a date that will be recorded with precision, but the true bequest was the slow dispersal of attention that preceded and followed that formal moment, the conversations in which manuscripts changed hands, the copies made for friends, the gradual permeation of Greek learning into the intellectual fabric of a city that had begun to hunger for it. The years between arrival and bequest accumulate their ordinary events, the meals taken, the colds suffered, the letters written and received. The scratch of reed pens on new paper, translating lost words, fills the hours that might otherwise have been given to regret. The Platonic Academy in Florence benefited from Byzantine emigrants, and the benefit was not merely the possession of manuscripts, but the presence of men who could read them without the mediation of Latin translation, who could explain the nuances of a language that had continued to live while its written forms were being preserved in the West with decreasing comprehension. Marsilio Ficino translated Plato's complete works, aided by Byzantine manuscripts, and the aid was sometimes the loan of a codex, sometimes the clarification of a passage where the manuscript tradition had grown uncertain, sometimes simply the confirmation that a particular reading was possible, that the Greek could bear a meaning that the Latin struggled to accommodate. The opening of trunks in Florentine studies, the smell of old parchment, becomes a repeated ceremony across the decades of the mid-15th century, each arrival adding its particular volumes to the accumulating resource from which the Renaissance would eventually be constructed. You are standing in a room where the light enters through a single window, and the window is small by modern preference, but sufficient for the task at hand. Here the commerce is intellectual, the exchange measured in attention, and the patience required to develop it. The dry crackle of parchment being unrolled after centuries sounds in this room as it has sounded in other rooms, in Constantinople, in Venice, in the various stopping places of a journey that has no true terminus. The study of ancient Greek became more widespread in Western Europe through these unrollings, through the gradual recognition that the language was not merely a theological instrument for reading the New Testament in its original form, but a medium for philosophy, for poetry, for the entire range of human expression that the classical world had achieved. The slow copying and translation, Greek into Latin, the words traveling again, proceeds at the pace of individual comprehension, each translator wrestling with the particular difficulties of a text that had not been addressed in the Latin West for centuries. The Renaissance as a named period only emerged in the 19th century, and the men who performed this labor did not know themselves to be founding a movement, did not conceive their work in terms of rebirth, though the term means rebirth in French, and though their efforts would eventually be gathered under that retrospective designation. They knew only the immediate difficulty of the next sentence, the next paragraph, the next dialogue whose argument resisted their understanding until some moment of illumination, some breakthrough in vocabulary or grammatical construction, permitted the Latin to flow with something approaching the confidence of the original. The humanist program emphasized the study of language and history, and the Byzantine scholars brought to that program a depth of linguistic knowledge that the Italian humanists, for all their enthusiasm, had not yet achieved. The cultural mediation of Byzantium had been ongoing for centuries before 1453, in the translations made for Arab scholars, in the diplomatic exchanges between courts, in the pilgrimages that moved in both directions across the Mediterranean. But the fall of Constantinople created a wave of refugees to the west that concentrated this mediation, that brought men of learning into direct and sustained contact with Italian centers of intellectual ambition in numbers, and with resources that transformed the occasional into the systematic. Many scholars fled to Italy, particularly to Venice and Florence, and their flight was not merely a dispersal, but a gathering, a concentration of expertise in the very places where the conditions for its employment were most favorable. The invention of printing with movable type, also occurring in this period, was equally significant, and the significance lies in the multiplication it permitted, the transformation of unique manuscripts into reproducible texts. But the printing required exemplars, and the exemplars came from the libraries that the Byzantine scholars had carried with them, from the copies made in Constantinople in the decades before its fall, from the traditions of accurate transcription that Byzantine scholarship had maintained. The integration of this knowledge into the burgeoning humanist movement of the 15th century proceeded through the institutions that received it, through the academies and the private studies, through the papal court and the republican chanceries. The fall of Constantinople was one factor among several in the development of the Renaissance, and its role was not to create, but to accelerate, to provide materials and expertise at a moment when the conditions for their reception were prepared. The shelves rise around you in their wooden solidity, and the manuscripts rest in their ordered places, and the scholars who brought them have become part of the history they preserved, their names recorded in catalogues and dedications, their handwriting identifiable to specialists who have made the study of scripts their particular devotion. The roughness of leather binding presses, still against the fingers of readers who have learned to handle these materials with the requisite care, who understand that the survival of these objects represents a chain of deliberate choices extending across generations. The last sight of the great city burning has passed from living memory into the record, into the accounts that subsequent scholars have compiled and questioned and revised. The night deepens around the harbor at dawn where you first stood, and the ships that carried the scholars have long since found their places in maritime museums or in the sediment of harbors where their timbers slowly release the last of their preserved moments. The smell of old parchment in Florentine studies mingles now with the other smells of the present, the coffee that sustains late reading, the electronic screens that replace the candle, the heating systems that maintain the temperatures that preservation requires. The Renaissance involved the revival of classical models in art, literature, and architecture, and that revival has itself become part of the past, has been succeeded by movements that questioned and rejected, and then occasionally returned to the classical with renewed appreciation. The term means rebirth in French, and the rebirth was not a single moment, but a prolonged labor, extending across the 15th century and beyond, finding its various expressions in the work of individuals who did not know themselves to be participating in a unified movement. The weight of a codex in the hands of Bessarion as he contemplated his collection, the roughness of leather binding that had traveled from Constantinople to Venice, and then to its institutional home, was the weight of possibility, of futures that could not be predicted, but only prepared for through the patient accumulation of resource. The darkness extends, and the shapes moving without color have resolved into the shapes of darkness itself, into the undisturbed stillness that holds all that has been said, and all that remains to be said in the equilibrium of its own perfect patience. The dry crackle of parchment being unrolled after centuries has faded into the silence, and the smell of ink and dust in a Venetian library, water lapping below, has dissolved into the larger atmosphere of night, and the weight of a codex in the hands has become the weight of sleep itself, the roughness of leather binding the texture of dreams that will come now in their own time, carrying with them whatever of this narrative they choose to preserve.